Hi there and welcome back. I'm really glad you found your way here again tonight. Maybe you're already wrapped in a blanket somewhere. Maybe the room around you has gone quiet and the light on your screen is turned down low. If that is you, good. That is exactly where I want you to be. Tonight we're going somewhere very few people ever think about. A place so far back in time and so far north on the map that most history books skip right past it without a second glance. But stay with me tonight, because without this one forgotten place, there would be no native nations spread across 2 continents, no villages carved into Arctic ice, no pyramids rising out of the jungle in Mexico, no lost cities built high in the mountains of Peru, none of it. So pull the blanket up a little higher, because tonight's story begins at the very edge of the world. Right now, somewhere beneath the cold, dark water of the Bering Strait, there is a lost world. No map shows it anymore. No country claims it. It slipped beneath the waves more than 10,000 years ago, and it took its people down with it. But before it disappeared, a small group of families lived there, trapped between 2 continents for longer than the pyramids of Egypt have stood. And from that one quiet frozen wait, almost every person native to the Americas was born. Before we step into their world together, I want to say one small thing. If stories like this one are exactly what you have been quietly hoping to find before bed, it would mean a lot if you tapped that subscribe button, left a like, or dropped a comment somewhere below. Only once you feel it is earned, though not before. I promise I will not ask twice. And honestly, I am always a little curious. Where in the world are you tonight, and what time is it there? Maybe you just finished a long shift. Maybe it is already well past midnight where you are. Either way, I would love to know, so say hello down in the comments if you feel like it. Now go ahead and turn the lights down as low as you can get them. Maybe switch on a soft fan or some gentle static in the background. Get yourself warm, get yourself still. And let's step back together into the last truly untouched winter this planet ever had. 20,000 years ago, give or take a few centuries either way, there was no such thing as America. Not the name, not the idea, not even the shape of it as we know it today. There was only ice-biting air and one very long, very cold wait. Picture a plain that stretches farther than your eyes could ever measure. No trees. Just grass and moss and low stubborn little shrubs clinging to the frozen ground, the kind of plants that seem to argue with winter, and somehow win. This land had a name once, long before anyone wrote it down, though we will never know what that name was. Today scientists simply call it Beringia. Not a bridge, not really, whatever the old textbooks might have told you. More like a hidden little continent of its own, quietly waiting between 2 much larger ones. And somewhere on it, close to a fire that is working very hard against the dark, a woman is waiting for her husband to come home. She's maybe 30 years old, though out here 30 feels closer to 60. Her hands are wrapped in fur sewn tight with a needle carved from bone thinner than a matchstick, sharp enough to pierce hide without splitting it. That needle, small as it is, might be one of the most important tools human beings ever invented. Because out here, clothing is not fashion. Clothing is the only thing standing between a person and a slow, quiet death. Beside her, a little girl, maybe 6 years old, is trying very hard to sit still while her grandmother combs through her hair with a comb carved from antler. "Stop wriggling," the old woman mutters not unkindly. "You wriggle more than a fish on a spear." The girl giggles because even at the bottom of the world, even in the cold, children still find something funny. A few steps away, an older boy, maybe 12, is repairing the frame of their shelter, a low dome of bent bone and stretched hide weighed down at the edges with stones against the wind. It is not much to look at, but inside it holds in just enough warmth to keep a family of 6 breathing until morning, and out here that is nothing short of a small miracle of engineering. This family's not alone out here, not really. A short walk across the grass, 2 more fires flicker in the dark, each one belonging to relatives, cousins, in-laws, old friends who decided generations ago that surviving alone was simply not worth the risk. Altogether, maybe 25 people, perhaps 30 on a good year, moving as one loose connected group across hundreds of miles of frozen grassland. It sounds small. In a world without cities, without walls, without anyone coming to help if something goes wrong, it is not small at all. It is everything. Above them the sky has started to move. Pale green light curling and folding over itself, stretching from one edge of the horizon to the other. We call it the aurora now. They likely had their own word for it, their own story about what it meant passed down by voice from grandmother to mother to daughter. The only kind of history book they had. Far off in the distance there is a sound. Low, deep, almost like thunder, except the sky above them is perfectly clear. It is the sound of ice groaning under its own enormous weight somewhere beyond the edge of what any of them will ever see with their own eyes. The woman looks toward that sound for a long moment. She's heard it every night this season, and every night it seems to come from just a little closer than before. Her husband finally appears out of the dark along with two other hunters dragging the frozen carcass of a young steppe horse behind them on a sled made of lashed bone and hide. It was not the kill they were hoping for. Somewhere out there, herds of mammoths still move across the grassland like slow-walking mountains. But a mammoth is a dangerous gamble, and tonight they needed something safer. Still there is meat. There is fire. There is a family together one more night. And for people living 20,000 years ago on the edge of an ice age, that alone counts as a victory worth celebrating. While the meat cook's the youngest hunter, barely older than a teenager himself, tells the story of the chase exaggerating the horse's speed a little more with every sentence, until the animal in his story is practically flying. The old woman rolls her eyes, but she is smiling. Some things, it turns out, never really change. A fisherman today would recognize that exact same look. Later, after the meal, after the fire has settled into low orange coals, the old woman speaks again, quieter this time. She tells the little girl that the land is changing, that the herds are moving further away every season, that somewhere far to the south and east the ice is growing taller, thicker, wider, swallowing whole valleys whole. She does not know it, of course, but she's describing something scientists would one day name the last glacial maximum, the coldest, driest stretch of the entire ice age, when two enormous ice sheets across the land to the east grew so large they eventually joined into one single unbroken wall. A wall with no door. A wall that would seal this family and every family like them onto this one strip of grassland between two continents for thousands and thousands of years to come. What almost no one realizes even now is that this waiting was not simply survival. It was the quiet, invisible beginning of something enormous. Somewhere in the bodies of the people gathered around this one small fire, tiny genetic changes were already beginning to set them apart from their cousins back in Siberia. Changes that scientists tens of thousands of years later would trace like fingerprints through the blood of their descendants. None of them could have known that. They only knew the cold, the fire, and each other. The mother pulls her daughter a little closer against the night air. The old woman keeps talking low and steady the way grandmothers do, weaving worry and comfort into the very same sentence. And somewhere above them the green light keeps moving across the sky, indifferent to the small, warm, breathing shape of a family who have no idea they are about to become the ancestors of two entire continents. Strange when you think about it. This little pocket of grassland caught between two continents will one day be remembered by scientists as one of the harshest, most forgotten corners of the Ice Age. And yet right now, tonight, it is warm enough and rich enough and kind enough to keep an entire family alive, fed and quietly laughing at a boy's exaggerated hunting story. Sometimes the places history forgets are the very places that quietly kept everything going. Maybe you know that feeling in your own way. Waiting for something to shift without knowing when or how or whether it ever will. A season that will not end. A door that has not opened yet. If so, there is something strangely comforting in knowing that thousands of years ago, on a stretch of land that no longer even exists, an entire people once felt exactly the same way, and simply kept the fire burning until morning. By the time the fire burns down to almost nothing, most of the camp has gone quiet. Only the mother stays awake a little longer, watching the last embers, listening to that same low distant groaning of ice somewhere past the horizon. Tomorrow they will pack up the shelters, load the sleds, and follow the herds further along the grassland exactly as they did last season, exactly as their parents did, and their parents before them. It is not a plan written down anywhere. It is simply a rhythm carried in the body in memory and habit, the same way birds seem to know when to fly south without ever being taught. That rhythm, repeated winter after winter, generation after generation, is the quiet engine that will eventually carry human beings into a hemisphere no person has ever set foot on before. Nobody sitting by this fire tonight will live to see it happen. Neither will their children, nor most likely their children's children. But it will happen. The little girl finally falls asleep somewhere between her grandmother's shoulder and her mother's lap, one hand still tangled in the fur blanket, completely unaware that she is living through one of the strangest, longest waiting periods in all of human history. A waiting period with no walls you could touch, and no way of knowing when or if the door on the far side would ever open again. To understand how one small family ended up camped on the edge of a vanishing world, waiting out a winter that would stretch on for thousands of years, we need to step back even further. Back before the ice sheets ever grew tall enough to meet. Back to a version of this planet so different you would hardly recognize it as home. Back to the moment a whole hidden stretch of land quietly rose out of the sea, and then just as quietly began waiting to disappear again. Because to really understand this family and the thousands of families who came after them, we first have to understand the strange forgotten world they were living on. A world that for a little while was not quite Asia and not quite America, but something in between. So let's start by clearing something up, because almost every map you have ever seen of this place has been lying to you just a little. Picture the word bridge for a second. A bridge is something narrow, something you cross quickly, glance over the railing, and forget by the time you reach the other side. That is the picture most of us grew up with, a thin little strip of frozen dirt connecting Asia to America. The kind of place you would walk across in an afternoon on your way to somewhere more interesting. Here is the problem with that picture. It is almost completely wrong. The land we're talking about was not a bridge in any sense you or I would recognize. At its widest, it stretched close to 1,000 miles from north to south, which means walking across it at a brisk, determined pace, without stopping to eat, sleep, or bury anyone would have taken well over a month. And that is before you factor in blizzards, river crossings, and the small matter of finding food along the way. Think about it this way, if that helps. 1,000 miles is roughly the distance from New York City to the middle of Kansas, or from London clear across to the northern tip of Scotland and back again. Now imagine making that entire journey on foot through snow, dragging children and elders and everything you own behind you, on a sled with no gas station, no highway rest stop, and absolutely no guarantee there would be food waiting anywhere along the way. Suddenly the word bridge feels almost insulting. This was not a hallway between two rooms. This was one of the rooms. An entire self-contained little world roughly the size of the state of Alaska, on its own, tucked quietly between two continents that most people assume were always separate. Scientists gave this place a name in 1937, a Swedish botanist by the name of Erik Hultén, who noticed something curious about the plants growing on either side of the Bering Strait. Similar species oddly related scattered across two continents that on paper should never have shared so much in common. He proposed that they had not evolved separately at all, but had once spread freely across a single connected landmass, and he named that vanished landmass after the explorer whose voyages first mapped the strait itself, a man named Vitus Bering. And here is a detail I happen to find quietly funny in a very dark, very ironic sort of way. Vitus Bering sailed through these waters in 1728, charting the strait that would eventually carry his name. By that point, the land bridge itself had already been underwater for roughly 10,000 years. He never saw it. He never knew it existed. An entire lost world named after a man who arrived several thousand years too late to ever lay eyes on it. If that is not a metaphor for how history usually works, I honestly do not know what is. We rarely name things after the people who actually lived through them. We name things after whoever happened to show up afterward with the notebook. Somewhere out there, an entire vanished homeland is technically named after a tourist. I say that with love, by the way, not disrespect. Vitus Bering did plenty of truly difficult, dangerous work charting those waters, but there is still something almost comical about it when you sit with it long enough. Remember that little girl from the fireside, the one who fell asleep with her hand still tangled in the fur blanket? She never once thought of her home as a bridge or a crossing point or a temporary stop on the way to somewhere better. To her, this was simply the world, the whole of it, the only one she'd ever known. Now, once researchers started digging deeper, quite literally, the true scale of this place only kept growing. Modern estimates put the land bridge itself at somewhere around 620,000 square miles, stretching from the Lena River in what is now Russia, all the way to the Mackenzie River in what is now Canada. But that number only covers the narrow definition, the strip of ground that used to sit where the Bering Strait sits today. Expand the boundary to include the connected unglaciated grasslands running along both sides of it, and you're suddenly looking at a combined territory of more than 4 million square miles. For comparison, that is roughly the size of the entire continent of Australia, quietly wedged into the gap between Siberia and Alaska, and almost nobody alive today has ever heard its name. If you tried driving across the narrow definition alone in a straight line today at highway speed without stopping for gas coffee or a single bathroom break, you would still be behind the wheel for the better part of 10 hours. And that is the boring, modern, air-conditioned version of the journey. Can I be honest with you for a second? I think that is one of the strangest things about this whole story. We build entire school curriculums around continents that still exist, and we barely mention the one that vanished. Maybe that is just human nature. We remember the winners. We remember the land that is still standing under our feet. But every so often it is worth sitting with the ground that did not make it, the places that simply ran out of time before we started paying attention. Here is where the story gets stranger still, because you would expect a place buried this deep inside an ice age to be exactly that, buried. Solid ice wall to wall, nothing living, nothing green. That is not what the evidence shows at all. While glaciers up to 2 miles thick were crushing their way across huge stretches of North America and Northern Europe, this particular strip of land stayed almost entirely ice-free. Not because it was warm, it absolutely was not, but because it was dry. Bitterly, relentlessly dry. Glaciers do not just need cold, they need snow. And snow needs moisture in the air, and this stretch of the world had almost none to spare. So instead of an ice sheet, it grew grass. Dry, tough wind, battered grassland stretching from horizon to horizon, somehow surviving in a climate that should have buried it completely. Think of it a little like the difference between a snowstorm and a drought that just happens to be freezing cold at the same time. Both are miserable, no question about that, but only one of them buries the ground under solid ice. The mountain ranges and ocean currents surrounding this stretch of land acted almost like a wall in their own right, wringing most of the moisture out of the air long before it ever reached this far north, which meant winter here looked less like the snow-covered postcards we picture today, and far more like a frozen desert, harsh, dusty, and strangely open. Researchers have a name for this kind of place now, a refugium, a pocket of livable ground hiding inside a much larger catastrophe. And once you understand that detail, this family's decision to stay right where they were, generation after generation, starts to look a lot less like bad luck and a lot more like quiet, patient wisdom. They were not trapped in the worst part of the Ice Age. They were standing in one of the only parts of the entire planet where an ice age this severe was actually survivable. There is a small, quiet lesson tucked inside that fact if you are willing to look for it. The most dramatic, most talked about places rarely turn out to be the ones that keep people alive. It is usually the overlooked corner, the plain patch of ground nobody bothers writing songs about, that ends up doing the real work of carrying a family or a people safely through to the other side of hard times. Now, if all of this sounds a little too strange to be true, a hidden world swallowed by rising seas still surfacing in fragments even today, I want to take you somewhere else for a moment, somewhere far from Alaska to show you this is not some rare one-time fluke of geological history. Have you ever stood on a beach somewhere and wondered what might be resting just past the waves under all that water? Turns out on more than one coastline around the world the answer is an entire vanished country. On the opposite side of the planet, underneath the cold grey water of the North Sea between modern-day Britain and mainland Europe, fishing trawlers have spent the last century hauling up something they were never expecting to find. Mammoth bones, antler harpoons, even on more than one occasion human bone. For decades, fishermen out there simply called that stretch of seafloor the elephant ground, tossing the strange bones back overboard, because they kept getting tangled in the nets. Nobody thought much of it until archaeologists finally connected the dots and realized those fishermen had been trawling straight through the drowned remains of an entire lost landscape, a place researchers now call Doggerland. Rivers, forests, marshes full of waterfowl, an entire thriving Ice Age homeland roughly the size of a small country that once connected Britain to the rest of Europe by dry land right up until rising seas swallowed the last of it a few thousand years after our family's story on the other side of the world. And Doggerland was not even the only one. Halfway around the world in what is now Southeast Asia, an entire shelf of dry land once connected islands like Sumatra, Borneo and Java into a single continuous landmass. Researchers now call Sunderland home to its own early human populations, long before those same rising seas carved the region into the scattered islands you would recognise on a map today. Different ocean, different climate, different people entirely, and yet the same pattern keeps repeating itself, almost like the planet has a habit it cannot quite break. Two continents apart on opposite ends of the Earth. Two completely unrelated groups of Ice Age people who never knew the other existed, and yet in both places the exact same quiet tragedy played out, a homeland slowly disappearing under rising water, taking whole generations of unrecorded lives down with it. If you're watching this from somewhere in the United Kingdom or along the coast of northern Europe tonight, there is a real chance the seafloor beneath your nearest beach used to be someone's front yard. Sit with that for a second. Back on the other side of the world, scientists studying Beringia have started using very similar tools to the ones that first revealed Doggerland sonar seismic surveys, originally built for oil exploration, deep sediment cores pulled up from the bottom of the Bering Sea. And slowly, piece by piece, an entire drowned landscape is starting to reappear on their screens. Old river channels still visible in the mud, cutting exactly where a river should not be able to cut unless there was once dry land above it. Ancient lake beds buried under 100 feet of frigid seawater. The ghost of a country nobody remembers living in, mapped out one sonar pulse at a time. Every so often, a fishing vessel working the Bering Sea today drags up something it was never expecting. Either a curved piece of ivory, a fragment of tusk, occasionally even a bone tool tumbled loose from sediment that has not seen open air in over 10,000 years. Fishermen up there have their own quiet folklore about it now, much like their counterparts across the Atlantic, stories about strange bones in the nets, passed around harbours the way ghost stories get passed around campfires. Somewhere down there underneath water so cold and so dark that sunlight never reaches the bottom, lies the actual physical ground our family from the beginning of this story once stood on, cooked dinner on, buried their loved ones in. We simply cannot walk on it anymore. We can only listen to the echoes it sends back, one sonar pulse, one sediment core, one stray fragment of ivory at a time. I find something quietly moving about that, if I am being honest with you. Most of history leaves behind ruins. You can visit walls, you can touch stones, you can stand beside. This particular chapter of human history left behind almost nothing solid at all. Just sediment and sound waves, and the strange, careful patience of scientists willing to spend entire careers listening to an empty seafloor, hoping it might finally tell them something. So here is where we stand, a vanished subcontinent roughly the size of Australia, hiding a livable pocket of grassland in the middle of the harshest ice age in tens of thousands of years, named after a man who arrived long after it had already drowned. A place quietly rhyming with lost landscapes on the other side of the planet, different ocean, different families, same slow, inevitable ending. But there is still a question sitting underneath all of this that we have not touched yet, and it might be the most important one of the entire story, because this land did not simply appear out of nowhere waiting patiently for people to arrive. Somebody had to walk there first. Somebody had to leave behind everything familiar, push further north and further east than any human being had ever gone before, chasing herds across landscapes growing colder, with every single step long before anyone had a word for Siberia, let alone Beringia. That walk did not begin at the edge of the ice. It began thousands of miles away under a completely different sky, in weather this family from the fireside would barely recognize as belonging to the same species of human being at all. To understand how that happened and just how far our species had already travelled before this story even begins, we need to go back much further than the Ice Age itself, all the way back to the very first footprints that ever left the warmth of home behind. Every single person watching this tonight, wherever you are, whatever your background happens to be, carries a piece of the exact same beginning. Not a similar beginning. Not a related one. The same one. Long before there was any wall of ice, any frozen homeland waiting to drown, any family huddled around a fire at the edge of the world, there was a much older starting point, and it did not happen anywhere near the Arctic. It happened in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago, which is a number so large it barely means anything until you try to picture it properly. So let's try. If every single one of those years were a single step, you would need to walk from Los Angeles to New York City and back again more than 60 times before you finally arrived at the beginning of our species. That is how far back we're going tonight. Long before Egypt raised a single stone, long before anyone had planted a single field of wheat, long before the word history even had a reason to exist, there were already people walking around with faces you would recognize instantly if you passed them on the street today. Not primitive, not half-formed, just people living lives we will never fully know the shape of under a sky none of us will ever stand beneath. In 1961, a group of miners working a barite quarry in Morocco, digging for a mineral used in paint and drilling equipment of all things, stumbled across a skull buried deep in the rock. They had no idea what they had actually found. For decades, researchers assumed it belonged to an ancient Neanderthal, a strange out-of-place cousin species that had somehow wandered into North Africa. It sat in that box for years, quietly mislabeled. Then in 2017, a research team went back with modern dating tools and got a very different answer, one that startled almost everyone in the field. The skull was not a Neanderthal at all. It was us. Homo sapiens, dated to roughly 300,000 years old, pushing the known origin of our own species back by an entire 100,000 years in a single afternoon of laboratory work. I have to be honest, this is one of my favourite kinds of story in all of history, not because of the bones themselves, but because of what the mistake says about us. For decades, the smartest people in the field looked directly at the origin of their own species and simply did not recognise it, because it did not match the story they had already decided was true. Makes you wonder how many other assumptions are still sitting quietly in a drawer somewhere waiting for someone to finally look again. Here is where the popular version of this story usually goes wrong, and I want to gently correct it because it matters for everything coming later tonight. Most people picture a single dramatic exodus, one small band of adventurous humans striding purposefully out of Africa on some grand, deliberate journey toward the rest of the world, the way it gets drawn in a textbook, one clean arrow sweeping across a map. Reality was messier, slower, and honestly far more human than that. There were multiple waves spread out across tens of thousands of years, some successful, many others quietly ending in failure in populations that pushed outward and then simply vanished, leaving no descendants behind at all. It is a little like watching waves roll onto a beach at night, if that image helps. Most of them break, pull back, and disappear without leaving much of a mark at all. Only a few manage to push far enough up the sand to actually change the shoreline. Human migration out of Africa worked in almost exactly that same rhythm, wave after wave after wave, most forgotten entirely one or two, eventually reshaping the whole of human history. Around 60 to 70,000 years ago, during a period when the climate briefly softened, and the Arabian Peninsula turned green instead of barren, one particularly successful wave of migration finally took hold, moving east along the coastlines and river valleys of Asia. And when these newcomers arrived, they discovered something the textbooks of my own childhood never mentioned. They were not alone. Neanderthals were already living across much of Europe and the Middle East, adapted to cold climates for hundreds of thousands of years, already thick-boned, powerfully built, deeply familiar with winters that would have killed a newly arrived African population outright. And somewhere along the way, in ways that must have ranged from cautious curiosity to real complicated intimacy, these two very different kinds of humans began having children together. We know this now with startling precision, thanks to a single remarkably well-preserved thigh bone pulled out of a riverbank in western Siberia back in 2008 by a local ivory carver who happened to notice it eroding out of the mud. Scientists later dated the bone to roughly 45,000 years old, making it one of the oldest fully sequenced modern human genomes ever recovered. And what it revealed still gives researchers chills. This man carried Neanderthal DNA in long unbroken stretches far longer than the tiny fragments most of us carry today, which told scientists something remarkable, that his own ancestors had interbred with Neanderthals only a few thousand years before he was born. In other words, somewhere in this man's own family tree, only a handful of generations back, sat a Neanderthal grandparent, or a great-grandparent, quietly folded into the human story most people assume never happened at all. Can I ask you something just to sit with for a moment? Does that change how you picture the word human even slightly? Because here is the part that always stays with me the longest. That man from the riverbank, despite being one of the earliest fully modern humans ever found so far into Asia, appears to have left no descendants among people alive today. His entire branch of the family tree dead-ended quietly without ceremony, sometime in the tens of thousands of years that followed. He was there. He was real. He lived, hunted, most likely loved someone, and raised children of his own. And history simply moved on without him the way it eventually moves on without most of us, if we are being completely honest about how time actually works. Not everyone from this era vanished so completely, though. Around the same span of centuries, roughly 40,000 years ago, a different individual living further east in what is now China left behind a genetic signature that tells a very different story, one that connects faintly but unmistakably all the way forward to the people who would eventually call the Americas home. History rarely moves in one single direction. It branches dead ends, loops back, and occasionally quietly plants a seed that will not fully bloom for tens of thousands of years. Now, if that riverbank discovery was not strange enough for one night, let me take you a little further into the mountains of southern Siberia, to a modest limestone cave that would go on to rewrite the entire human family tree from a single tiny bone. In 2008, archaeologists working in a place called Denisova Cave uncovered a small fragment of a pinky finger, so unremarkable looking that it was initially labelled and boxed away as belonging to an ordinary modern human. It sat quietly in storage for 2 years. Then, in 2010, researchers finally ran its genetic sequence, expecting nothing particularly unusual. What came back did not match modern humans. It did not match Neanderthals either. It matched nothing on record at all. Scientists had just discovered an entirely new branch of the human family, later named the Denisovans, a group that had split off from the Neanderthal lineage hundreds of thousands of years earlier, and quietly built an entire separate existence across Siberia and parts of Asia, almost completely unknown to science, until one careless finger bone finally spoke up, And it gets even more remarkable because a few years later, researchers analysing another bone fragment from that exact same cave discovered something that still feels almost too perfect to be real. A young girl, roughly 13 years old when she died, whose mother had been Neanderthal and whose father had been Denisovan. Two entirely different branches of the human story quietly meeting, loving and raising a child together inside the same modest cave where scientists would eventually find her, tens of thousands of years later, one single bone fragment at a time. Researchers nicknamed her Denny. I think about her more than I probably should. An actual child of two different kinds of human being existing at exactly the crossroads where our own species was busy rewriting the rules of what it even meant to be human at the same time in the same remote patch of mountains that our family from the beginning of this story would eventually pass through themselves. We tend to imagine the ancient past as something rigid, clean lines separating one kind of human from another, as though nature kept everything neatly organized into labeled boxes. Denny is proof that reality was far messier and honestly far warmer than that. Somewhere in that cave, a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father found each other in a world without maps, without language, as we would recognize it without any of the categories scientists would eventually invent to describe them. They simply lived. They simply loved. And they left behind a daughter who would end up teaching an entire species tens of thousands of years later just how blurry the lines of being human have always really been. So why keep pushing further and further into landscapes this hostile, this cold, this obviously unwelcoming to a species that originally evolved beneath the warm sun of an African savanna? Population pressure certainly played its part. More mouths to feed eventually meant more distance between hunting grounds, generation after generation, family groups quietly fanning outward in search of territory nobody else had already claimed. But I think there is something else going on underneath the practical explanations, something a little harder to measure with radiocarbon dating or DNA sequencing. Every single wave of this migration was in its own way chasing food on four legs, mammoth, bison, wild horse herds of megafauna that themselves kept drifting further north and east as the climate shifted decade after decade, century after century. Follow the herd far enough, patiently enough, and eventually you look up one day and realize you have walked yourself to the edge of the entire known world without ever really deciding to. There is a kind of restlessness built into our species, I think something that shows up again and again across the whole span of human history, an inability to simply stop once the horizon is still visible up ahead. Think about your own life for a moment, if you do not mind me asking. How many decisions have you made moving cities, changing careers, even just taking a longer road home for no real reason, simply because staying exactly where you were started to feel unbearable? We like to imagine ourselves as fundamentally different from these ancient wandering ancestors, safer, more settled, more rational. Most of the time I'm not entirely convinced that we are. It got us into Siberia 45,000 years ago. It got a very different group of us onto the surface of the moon a few thousand generations later. Same restless species, wildly different tools. By the time descendants of these early Siberian populations had pushed further north, still deeper into landscapes growing colder and harsher, with every passing generation, they were no longer simply following animals out of curiosity. They had crossed a threshold sewing needles fine enough to produce tightly fitted clothing hearths, sophisticated enough to hold a flame through truly brutal winters, social networks stretched wide enough that even small scattered bands could trade tools, stories and marriage partners across enormous distances without ever losing touch completely. None of these breakthroughs happened overnight, and none of them belonged to a single brilliant inventor whose name got carved into a monument somewhere. They accumulated slowly, one small improvement passed from grandmother to granddaughter, one better fitting seam, one slightly warmer lining refined and re-refined across hundreds of generations, until an entire toolkit for surviving genuine cold had quietly assembled itself almost without anyone realizing a threshold had been crossed at all. That, if you ask me, might be the real engine behind this entire migration, not a single dramatic leap, but an almost invisible accumulation of small patient improvements, each one barely noticeable on its own, each one making the next impossible winter just slightly more survivable than the last. Cold, in other words, had stopped being an immediate death sentence and had slowly become something else entirely, something survivable, something eventually almost ordinary, and that shift, quiet, gradual, and almost invisible from the outside, is precisely what finally opened the door toward the very edge of the map, toward a stretch of frozen grassland at the top of the world that most of humanity had no reason to even imagine existed. Somewhere out there at the furthest edge of everything these early Siberian populations had already achieved. One particular archaeological site was waiting to be found thousands of years in the future that would prove people had pushed further into the cold and far earlier than anyone studying this story ever thought humanly possible. It sits above the Arctic Circle in a place so remote that even today very few people ever manage to visit it. And what researchers eventually pulled out of the frozen ground there would not just support everything we've talked about tonight. It would completely rewrite the timeline of how close humanity had already come to the very door of this vanished frozen world, long before anyone thought that door had even been found. Let me take you there now, because that place has a name and it deserves one. In the summer of 1993, a Russian geologist named Mikhail Dashtzerin was walking along the banks of a river. Most people on this planet will never hear mentioned once in their entire lives, somewhere in the far northeastern reaches of Siberia, when something caught his eye sticking out of a thawing riverbank. The permafrost up there has a strange habit of holding on to things far longer than it should, and then every so often simply letting go. Rivers up in that part of the world do not behave the way rivers do further south. They carve slowly through frozen ground that has not properly thawed in tens of thousands of years, and every summer as the surface softens just enough to crumble, the riverbank quietly gives back a little more of whatever it has been holding on to since the last ice age. What Dashtzerin pulled free from the mud that day was a carved spear point fashioned not from stone or wood, but from the horn of a woolly rhinoceros, an animal that has not existed anywhere on Earth for thousands of years. He had no way of knowing it yet, but he was holding a piece of one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the last 100 years. Word eventually reached an archaeologist named Vladimir Pitulko, who followed Dashtzerin's directions back to that same bend in the river, and by 2001 a full excavation was underway. What they uncovered there would eventually force scientists to rewrite an entire chapter of the human story, quietly, patiently, one frozen artifact at a time. Today researchers simply call it the Yana Rhinoceros Horn Site, and if that name sounds a little clinical for how remarkable this place actually is, trust me, the numbers make up for it. Here is the detail that ought to stop you in your tracks for a second. This site sits north of the Arctic Circle in the far western edge of the very same vanished landmass we spent time exploring earlier tonight. The outer edge of Beringia itself, long before that grassland ever became a refuge for anyone trying to escape a wall of ice. Which means the people living here were not simply passing through on their way somewhere else. They were already standing at the front door, and they had been standing there for a very, very long time. Radiocarbon dating places human activity at Yana at roughly 32,000 years ago, which puts these people comfortably above the Arctic Circle, almost 10,000 years before the worst of the Ice Age had even properly begun. 10,000 years? Sit with that figure for a moment because it tends to get glossed over quickly in most retellings of this story. 10,000 years ago from where we stand right now would put you somewhere in the very earliest beginnings of farming before writing, before cities, before anything resembling the world you or I would recognize. Now take that same enormous stretch of time and place it entirely before the coldest, harshest period of an entire ice age had even fully arrived. That is how far ahead of schedule these people were. Try picturing it this way for a second. Imagine discovering that a small town of your own ancestors had been quietly thriving in northern Canada, fully self-sufficient 10,000 years before the pyramids of Egypt were ever imagined, let alone built. That is roughly the scale of head start we're talking about here. Except instead of stone and sand, the whole story is written in ivory and frozen mud. So who exactly were they, and how did they manage it? Excavators also found small bowls carved from bone and ivory, their rims patiently notched with tally marks, whose exact meaning nobody alive can fully explain anymore. A hunting count, perhaps? A calendar of some kind tracking the slow turn of seasons in a place where the sun itself barely rises for weeks at a stretch during the darkest months. Or maybe just something closer to doodling the ancient equivalent of absent-mindedly carving a groove into a table edge during a long quiet evening. We will likely never know for certain, and there is something oddly comforting in that particular mystery, a reminder that even people who left behind almost nothing in the way of written words still found ways to mark time, to count, to remember. Excavators eventually recovered more than 2,500 separate artifacts scattered across the site: tools, weapons, ornaments, the quiet debris of daily life preserved almost perfectly by permafrost that never quite let go. Among them, something that truly surprised researchers: roughly 6,000 individual beads carved from mammoth ivory animal teeth, and small polished minerals, evidence of people who are not simply surviving out here, but decorating themselves while they did it. I think that detail deserves a little more attention than it usually gets. Somewhere above the Arctic Circle, in temperatures that would stop most of us in our tracks within the hour, someone sat down patiently, deliberately, and carved thousands of tiny beads purely to look beautiful. Not to eat, not to stay warm, simply to feel like a person worth looking at. Whatever else you want to say about the human species, we have clearly never once been willing to give up on beauty, even at the absolute edge of survival. Have you ever caught yourself doing something similar, putting on a bit of jewellery, choosing a nicer shirt on a day when, practically speaking, none of it should matter at all? I think that same small, stubborn impulse is exactly what we're looking at here, just a few tens of thousands of years earlier, carved into ivory instead of hanging in a closet. Let's talk about that rhinoceros horn spear point for a moment, because it is a small object with a surprisingly clever story behind it. Out here on a treeless, wind-battered plain wood for tool handles was almost impossible to come by, which left these early engineers with a genuine problem to solve. Their solution was to build the business end of a hunting spear, the part that actually needed to survive the violent impact of striking a mammoth or a rhinoceros, out of dense, durable ivory or horn, instead carved into a socketed foreshaft that could hold a sharpened stone or bone tip firmly in place. If that tip snapped off mid-hunt, and it certainly did more often than anyone would have liked, the hunter was not left standing there with a useless stick. He simply pulled the foreshaft, fitted a fresh point, and kept going. It is essentially one of the earliest modular tool designs we've ever recovered, an interchangeable part system built entirely by hand, tens of thousands of years before anyone had a word for engineering. If you want a modern comparison, think of it a little like swapping the head on a screwdriver instead of throwing the whole tool away the moment one bit wears down. Simple idea once you say it out loud. Extraordinarily difficult to actually invent from nothing, in a landscape offering you almost no margin for error, and absolutely no instruction manual to fall back on. And the animals these tools were built to hunt read almost like a fever dream today. Woolly mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, steppe bison, wild horse, reindeer. And in case you needed a reminder of just how different this world once looked, actual lions, a now extinct cave lion subspecies that once prowled this same frozen grassland, hunting many of the very same animals these humans were chasing. Picture that for a second if you can. An Arctic landscape shared not just with mammoths, but with lions, real lions stalking the same open plain where a small band of humans were quietly building a life, armed with little more than ivory-tipped spears and an extraordinary amount of nerve. There were no fences out here, no watchtowers, no safe side of a barrier separating hunter from predator, just open ground shared uneasily between two very different kinds of apex hunter, each one in its own way simply trying to make it through to spring. Now here is where this story takes a turn that even the researchers themselves did not fully expect, and it happened almost 20 years after the site was first uncovered. Buried within all those thousands of artifacts, archaeologists eventually recovered exactly 2 pieces of actual human remains. Not skeletons, not skulls, but 2 small baby teeth, the kind that fall out naturally sometime in early childhood and get quietly forgotten by almost everyone who ever loses one. In 2019, a team of geneticists finally sequenced the DNA hidden inside those 2 tiny teeth, and the results made headlines around the world. The teeth belonged to 2 young boys, likely an uncle and his nephew, based on how closely related their genetic material turned out to be, and their genome did not match anything scientists had catalogued before. Researchers ended up naming this previously unknown population the ancient North Siberians, a group that appeared to be a strikingly even blend of 2 very different ancestral populations. One related to early people living far to the west, closer to modern-day Europe, the other related to early populations further east in Asia. 2 branches of the human story already quietly intertwined at the very top of the world 31,000 years before anyone would ever write that sentence down. Researchers studying this population believe the entire group probably numbered somewhere around 500 people, spread thin across an enormous stretch of frozen territory. 500 people, that is roughly the size of a single large high school graduating class, holding on alone at the absolute edge of the habitable world, with nothing behind them but ocean, and nothing ahead of them but an ice age still gathering strength. I want to pause here on something that easy summaries of this discovery tend to skip right past because I think it actually matters. These 2 boys were not strictly speaking the direct ancestors of the people who eventually crossed into the Americas. Genetically, their particular population appears to have mostly faded out over the following millennia, contributing only a modest thread of ancestry to later groups, rather than being the whole story itself. It is tempting, I know, to want one clean, tidy answer, one single population you can point to and say that is where it all began. But actual history rarely hands us anything that tidy, and if you've been with me through this whole story so far tonight, that pattern should already sound familiar. Waves that rise and mostly recede, populations that flourish for a while blend into their neighbours and quietly dissolve into someone else's family tree. The truth almost always turns out to be a slow tangled braid rather than a single straight thread. What Jana really proves is something a little different and honestly a little more remarkable than a tidy origin story. It proves that human beings had already mastered this landscape fully, mastered it an entire 10,000 years before the worst of the Ice Age forced anyone into a true standstill. These were not desperate refugees stumbling blindly into unfamiliar territory once the wall of ice began closing in. They were already skilled established decorating themselves with beads, repairing their own broken tools hunting lions' prey directly out from under the lions themselves. By the time the true crisis arrived, the deep freeze that would eventually seal this entire region off from the rest of the world for thousands of years, the people living in this part of the world were not walking into the unknown. They were already home, which raises a question worth sitting with for a moment, one I still find myself turning over even now. If a small population of Arctic hunter-gatherers could pull off something, this sophisticated, ivory engineering decorative artistry complex hunting strategy, all of it fully in place, fully 10,000 years before the hardest chapter of the Ice Age even began. What does that tell us about how we tend to underestimate people who lived without writing, without cities, without anything we would recognize as civilization on a textbook timeline? I think we do it constantly, if I am honest with you. We build entire documentaries, entire museum wings around gold masks and stone monuments, and quietly walk right past a small carved bead that took just as much patience, just as much imagination to create. We quietly assume competence only shows up alongside architecture and written language, when the truth sitting frozen in that riverbank says something very different. These people were not primitive. They were prepared, and preparation, as it turns out, was about to matter more than any of them could have possibly imagined. Because somewhere out past the horizon, these hunters had spent generations learning to read weather patterns, were already shifting in ways too slow for any single lifetime to notice. Snow was falling a little heavier some winters than it used to. Rivers were freezing a little earlier and breaking apart a little later year after year in changes so gradual that no elder, however wise, could have possibly connected the pattern in time. Somewhere far to the south and east of this small thriving community, two enormous sheets of ice were quietly growing toward one another, inch by inch, century by century, on a collision course that would eventually seal this entire stretch of the world away from everything south of it for longer than any single human lifetime could ever measure. To understand exactly what was closing in on that small community of hunters, you have to stop thinking about ice the way most of us picture it on a quiet winter morning. Forget snowflakes. Forget frost on a window. What we're talking about here is almost nothing in common with anything gentle. At its full strength, this particular mass of ice was not sitting quietly on top of the land. It was moving, grinding, flowing like an impossibly slow river of solid stone-carving valleys, swallowing mountains and quietly rewriting the entire shape of a continent, while barely anyone alive at the time had a name for what was happening to their world. Under its own staggering weight, ice like this behaves less like the frozen puddle on your driveway, and more like a glacier of wet concrete moving only inches a year, in places yet powerful enough to grind solid granite down into fine gravel, simply by passing over it slowly enough for long enough. Geologists studying the aftermath today can still trace the scratch marks it left behind, long straight grooves carved directly into solid bedrock across huge stretches of Canada, the same way a fingernail might drag a faint line across a bar of soap, except the fingernail in question weighed several trillion tons, and the soap was an entire mountain range. Geologists gave two names to the twin giants responsible for all of this. The Laurentide ice sheet centered somewhere around what is now Hudson Bay in Canada, and the Cordilleran ice sheet anchored further west, along the mountain ranges hugging the Pacific coast. Both had been growing for tens of thousands of years by this point, patiently, relentlessly, one snowfall at a time in a part of the world where summer heat could no longer melt away what winter had left behind. You might reasonably be wondering at this point why the planet would even bother building something this extreme in the first place. The honest answer involves something happening nowhere near the ground at all but far above it, in the slow, wobbling geometry of Earth's own orbit around the Sun. Over tens of thousands of years, the tilt of our planet and the shape of its path around the Sun drift very slightly, in cycles first properly worked out by a Serbian scientist named Milutin Milankovic. Small shifts on their own, barely worth mentioning, but stretch those small shifts out across enough summers, each one just a little cooler and shorter than the one before, and snow that once fully melted every year slowly stops melting completely, compounding layer upon layer, decade after decade, until an entire continent finds itself quietly buried under its own accumulated winters. Nobody was watching a thermometer. Nobody understood orbital mechanics. They simply lived through the slow, patient, almost invisible result of it, one unusually late spring at a time. Here is where the scale of this thing stops being an abstract historical detail and starts becoming something almost impossible to properly picture. At its thickest points, the Laurentide ice sheet alone reached somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 feet from base to summit. If you have ever stood in Manhattan and looked up at the skyline, take a moment to imagine every single building you can see completely buried, and then imagine roughly 4 more skylines worth of solid ice stacked directly on top of that one. Historians estimate the ice sitting over what is now New York City alone was close to 2,000 feet thick. 2,000 feet over a single city block before you even get anywhere near the thickest parts further north. Every subway tunnel, every rooftop, every yellow taxi horn you have ever heard in your life, sitting silently and visibly underneath an amount of ice, tall enough to bury the entire island several times over with room to spare. Together, these two ice sheets eventually covered more than 5 million square miles of North America, an area larger than the entire United States is today, holding so much frozen water within their combined mass that scientists estimate it was equal to roughly 1.5 times everything currently locked up inside the Antarctic ice sheet, which remains even now the largest single mass of ice anywhere on the planet. Every ounce of that water had once been ordinary rain, ordinary snow, ordinary ocean, before slowly, patiently, one storm system at a time, it found its way north and simply stopped leaving again. Can I ask you something honestly? Does a number like that even mean anything anymore once it gets that large? Or does your brain just quietly give up trying to hold the whole shape of it at once? Mine does, if I am being completely honest with you. And I have been sitting with these numbers for weeks putting this story together. Sometime around 20,000 years ago, during the very coldest stretch of the entire Ice Age, these two enormous, separately growing ice masses finally did something that would end up reshaping the fate of an entire hemisphere. They touched. Along the eastern edge of the Rocky Mountains, where the Laurentide sheet pushing westward finally met the Cordilleran sheet pushing east, the two masses fused into a single unbroken wall of ice, stretching from somewhere near the Arctic Ocean, almost all the way down toward the modern-day border between Canada and the continental United States. There was no gap, no mountain pass left uncovered, no river valley left open, just ice in every direction for longer than any single human lifetime could have possibly walked across. I want you to sit with what that actually meant for the people we've been following tonight, the ones already living comfortably in Beringia, already skilled hunters, already masters of a landscape most of us would consider unlivable. Their world had not simply gotten colder, it had been sealed, whatever lay to the south, whatever warmer lands, whatever unknown territory might once have been reachable by walking far enough in the right direction, was now separated from them by a barrier taller than almost anything the human eye had ever tried to comprehend before. Now here is a detail I find myself thinking about more than almost anything else in this entire story, and it rarely gets mentioned outside of academic papers. Nobody woke up one morning and simply decided the way south was closed. There was no single dramatic moment, no elder standing at the edge of camp pointing toward an obvious, unmistakable wall. This barrier built itself slowly, gradually over centuries, the kind of change that would have been truly difficult for any one family, or even several generations of families, to fully notice happening in real time. A hunting party might have set out one season following a promising trail a little further south than usual, and simply turned back a few weeks later, discouraged, having found nothing but featureless ice where open ground used to be. Picture them coming home exhausted, their sleds lighter than when they left, unable to fully explain to the rest of the camp exactly what they'd run into, only that the world simply stopped somewhere out past the mountains in a way none of them had words for yet. Maybe they tried again a few years later. Maybe a different family tried further along the mountain range with the same disappointing result. Slowly, through nothing more dramatic than repeated failure, a kind of inherited knowledge would have settled into the culture itself, passed down the way all crucial survival information gets passed down, without written language, through story, through warning, through the careful, patient voice of someone older, telling someone younger exactly which direction not to bother wasting a season walking toward. We still do this today if you think about it, just with different landscapes. Every family seems to carry its own quiet list of directions not worth walking, warnings passed down about which risks are not worth taking, which doors tend to stay shut no matter how many times someone knocks. Ours usually come wrapped in different language now, financial advice, relationship warnings, career cautions offered at a holiday dinner table. But the underlying instinct protecting the next generation from repeating an exhausting, disappointing search is exactly the same one that would have echoed around a fire on the edge of this frozen grassland thousands of generations before any of us were born. There is something quietly heartbreaking about that if you let yourself sit with it for a moment. An entire people slowly discovering the edges of their own world not through some single dramatic revelation, but through years of smaller, unremarkable disappointments, each one just barely enough to teach the next generation a boundary nobody had ever needed to know existed before. Here is where this story loops back on itself in a way that still catches me off guard every time I think about it properly. Remember the sea level dropping low enough to expose that vast stretch of grassland between two continents, the very ground our family had been calling home this entire time? That drop in sea level was not some separate, unrelated event happening quietly in the background. It was caused by this exact same ice. Every single foot of ocean pulled back from the world's coastlines had been physically lifted out of the sea and stacked snowflake by snowflake, century by century, into the very same ice sheets that were now sealing off any escape route to the south. The wall trapping this family in place and the solid ground keeping them alive in the first place were in the most literal sense possible made of exactly the same water. I do not know about you, but I find something almost poetic in that particular cruelty. The very thing that gave them a homeland was the very thing that eventually locked the door behind them. There is one more piece of evidence for all of this that I think deserves a moment of your attention, mostly because it is still happening quietly right now while you listen to this. All that weight, millions of square miles of ice piled thousands of feet high, pressed down on the Earth's crust, hard enough to physically deform it, pushing the solid rock beneath the ice sheets downward, the way a mattress sinks under someone standing on it. When the ice finally melted thousands of years later, that pressure lifted, and the land slowly began rising back up, the way a mattress slowly regains its shape once someone finally steps off. Here is the part that truly surprises most people the first time they hear it. That process never actually finished. Around Hudson Bay today, geologists can still measure the ground rising millimetre by millimetre year after year, the land still quietly rebounding from a weight that disappeared thousands of years ago. In parts of Scandinavia, which endured a very similar burden of ice on the opposite side of the planet, old harbour towns built centuries ago now sit noticeably inland from the water, stranded by a coastline that has been quietly retreating ever since the ice above it disappeared. Fishermen there still joke half seriously about docks their grandfathers used that no longer reach the sea at all. We are not just telling a story about the Ice Age tonight. In a very real, measurable sense, a small part of the planet is still finishing the sentence one slow millimetre at a time, whether anyone happens to be paying attention or not. So there they were, an entire community skilled, resourceful, already proven capable of surviving conditions that would kill most of us within a single night, now facing a boundary with no visible edge, no clear beginning, and absolutely no way of knowing whether it would ever open again in their lifetime, their children's lifetime, or any lifetime they could reasonably imagine planning for. If you've ever waited for news, you had no control over a diagnosis, a decision, an answer that simply refused to arrive on any schedule you could plan around. You already understand a small piece of what this must have felt like, stretched out across not months, not years, but thousands of years passed down like an inheritance nobody ever asked to receive. How do you keep telling children a hopeful story about tomorrow when your own grandparents were told the exact same hopeful story, and it still has not come true? I think that question sits at the very heart of tonight's entire story, whether the people living through it ever had the language to ask it quite so directly or not. And yet somehow this same sealed-off landscape did not become a graveyard. It became something else entirely, a strange, unlikely little pocket of the world that managed to keep an entire population fed, sheltered, and quietly thriving, right in the middle of the harshest stretch of the Ice Age humanity has ever had to survive. That fact alone should sound almost impossible once you consider everything we have just walked through together. Ice thick enough to bury a mountain range, a boundary wide enough to swallow a continent whole, and yet somewhere inside all of that life simply refused to stop. How exactly a treeless, wind-battered stretch of frozen grassland managed to keep so many lives going for so long, while entire continents around it turned into frozen, lifeless desert, is a story that deserves its own careful attention, and it is exactly where we are headed next. Here is the question that stumped scientists for the better part of a century, and honestly it is a fair one to ask. If this land was cold enough, dry enough, and harsh enough to sit directly beside a wall of ice thousands of feet thick, how on earth did it manage to feed anyone at all, let alone an entire population of humans alongside herds of animals, large enough to make an elephant look modest by comparison? For decades, the leading assumption among researchers was fairly bleak. Picture the modern Arctic tundra you've probably seen in a documentary somewhere. Spongy moss scattered lichen, a landscape that looks green from a distance, but barely supports more than a scattering of grazing caribou. If Beringia looked anything like that, the math simply should not have worked. You cannot feed herds of mammoths and the humans hunting them off a diet of damp moss. A single adult mammoth alone needed to eat several hundred pounds of vegetation every single day, just to keep its own enormous body running, and this landscape was supposedly home to thousands of them, alongside herds of horse, bison and reindeer competing for the exact same ground. On paper, the arithmetic simply refused to balance. Researchers eventually gave this contradiction its own name, the productivity paradox, and solving it took decades of extremely patient, extremely unglamorous work, most of it done by scientists sifting through frozen dirt one careful layer at a time. The answer, once it finally came together, turned out to be almost the exact opposite of what everyone originally assumed. Beringia was not soggy, mossy tundra at all. It was something closer to a cold, dry grassland, closer in spirit to the open plains of Africa than to the wet Arctic bogs most of us picture when we hear the word tundra. Because the region received so little snow and rain, the ground never developed that thick, spongy moss layer that chokes out productive grasses in wetter, Arctic environments today. Instead, dry conditions favoured tough, mineral-rich grasses and flowering herbs, plants that pack far more nutrition per bite than moss ever could spread out across an endless open plain. Less water, paradoxically, meant more food. I love that particular twist, if I am honest with you. We tend to assume rain automatically means abundance, and drought automatically means starvation, and most of the time that instinct serves us just fine. But every so often, nature quietly breaks its own rules, and an entire ecosystem manages to thrive precisely because of the very harshness that should have destroyed it. I think about that a little differently now than I did before researching this particular story. We tend to describe hardship as something purely subtractive, something that only ever takes away. This landscape suggests the relationship can run the other direction too, that certain kinds of difficulty, the right kind applied in the right way, can occasionally strip away exactly the excess that was holding real abundance back in the first place. Once researchers pieced together exactly what was growing out there, the numbers finally started making sense. Scientists studying animal remains preserved in the permafrost have estimated that this landscape supported something in the neighbourhood of 10 tons of grazing animal per square kilometre in some of the richer patches, a density of life comparable to the great wildlife thick grasslands of Africa today. Let that land properly for a second. The coldest, driest grassland on the entire planet sitting directly beside a wall of ice, 2 miles thick, somehow managed to carry roughly the same weight of living, breathing animals per acre as the plains of the Serengeti carry right now, on the opposite side of the globe under a blazing equatorial sun. If you had shown that fact to a scientist 50 years ago, they likely would not have believed you. Try picturing a wildlife documentary crew setting up their cameras out here, instead of the Serengeti parkas, instead of khaki breath fogging in front of the lens, instead of heat shimmering off dry savanna grass, and yet capturing roughly the same staggering density of life either way. Same abundance, completely different climate, entirely different. Set of animals wearing entirely different coats. So who exactly made up that 10 tons of wandering grazing life? Woolly mammoths obviously moving in small family groups the way modern elephants still do. Woolly rhinoceros built low and heavily muscled against the wind. Herds of wild horse and steppe bison grazing side by side the way zebra and wildebeest still do across the African plains today, each one nibbling a slightly different height and type of grass, which as it turns out is not a coincidence at all. Saiga antelope, a strange big-nosed little creature built almost like nature's own air filter, its oddly shaped snout designed specifically to warm and filter freezing dust-laden air before it ever reached the animal's lungs. And reindeer endlessly migrating the same restless rhythm their modern descendants still follow across the far north today, alongside sturdy little muskoxen wrapped in a coat so thick and so warm that people living in the Arctic today still gather and spin its undercoat into wool softer than cashmere. If you own anything made from muskox wool and a surprising number of people quietly, you're wearing a small functional descendant of exactly the same survival strategy this ecosystem perfected tens of thousands of years ago. Here is the part ecologists find truly elegant about this whole system. If you do not mind me getting a little nerdy with you for a moment, each of these species tended to eat a slightly different part of the same landscape mammoths, pulling up coarse, deep-rooted grasses, horses cropping shorter growth close to the ground, bison working the mid-range in between. Picture a shared dinner table if that helps, when nobody actually needs to fight over the same plate, because everyone at the table happens to prefer a completely different dish. Rather than competing with each other for identical food, this entire community of enormous animals had almost accidentally divided the landscape between themselves, each one keeping a different section of grass trimmed, fertilized, and thriving simply by going about its own business. Remove the grazers and researchers have shown the grass itself eventually suffocates under thick moss and shrub, exactly the transformation that helped end this ecosystem entirely, once the animals themselves began disappearing thousands of years later. In other words, the animals were not simply living on top of this landscape. They were in a very real sense building it one bite at a time, generation after generation. There is another wrinkle to this story that researchers only pieced together fairly recently, and I think it deserves a moment of attention because it complicates the picture in a good way. Beringia was never one single uniform grassland from end to end. Running roughly north to south through parts of the region, a slightly wetter, shrubbier strip of land existed alongside the drier steppe, a kind of ecological seam where two different plant communities met and occasionally clashed. Some researchers have taken to calling it a buckle, the way a belt buckles slightly differently than the leather stretched out on either side of it. For certain plants and insects, that damp corridor became a lifeline, a narrow bridge of familiar habitat running through an otherwise unfamiliar world. For others, it became an invisible wall almost as real as the ice sheets themselves, a strip of terrain just different enough that entire species on one side never successfully crossed to the other for tens of thousands of years without either side ever really knowing the other existed. Even inside a refuge, in other words, there were smaller refuges and smaller barriers tucked one inside another, like a set of increasingly specific nesting dolls. Now, how do scientists even know any of this sitting here tonight, tens of thousands of years after the fact? A surprising amount of the answer comes from something almost embarrassingly small fossilized insects, specifically the hardened outer shells of ancient beetles, preserved by the thousands in frozen soil layers across the region. Beetles, it turns out, make remarkably honest witnesses. Unlike pollen, which can blow in from hundreds of miles away and confuse the picture, beetles tend to live and die exactly where you find them, and different species can only survive within very specific, well-documented temperature ranges. By identifying which beetle species appear in a given layer of ancient soil, researchers can reconstruct the exact climate of that precise place and moment, with startling accuracy, sometimes narrowing an ancient summer's average temperature down to within just a degree or two. Some of these beetle species can even survive briefly supercooled below freezing, without their bodies turning to ice, a trick of internal chemistry that let them endure winters harsh enough to have wiped out closely related cousins, living only a few hundred miles further south. Scientists studying these frozen little bodies today can tell you with genuine confidence roughly how cold a given August evening felt tens of thousands of years before anyone thought to invent the calendar, let alone the thermometer. An entire climate record hidden inside creatures smaller than your fingernail, patiently waiting in the permafrost for someone patient enough to go looking. I find something quietly moving about the idea that the humblest, most overlooked little creatures in an ecosystem end up being the ones who tell us the truth about it, long after every larger, more impressive witness has already turned to dust. All of this mattered enormously for the small community of hunters we've been following tonight. They were not simply surviving on the ragged edge of an empty wasteland. They were living inside one of the most productive hunting grounds on the entire planet, an endless walkable buffet of mammoth, horse, bison and reindeer, each species offering a slightly different set of resources beyond just meat. Bones sturdy enough to build the frame of a shelter, sinew strong enough to lash a spear point in place, hide thick enough to turn away a wind that could otherwise kill a person within hours. And in a landscape almost entirely without trees, even the animals themselves quietly solved the region's fuel problem. Dense fatty bone burns surprisingly well once a fire is already going, which meant a successful hunt did not just fill a family's stomach for the week. It kept them warm through the following weeks as well. Archaeologists studying hearths from this general period across Siberia have found exactly that charred fragments of bone mixed in with the ash, evidence of fires that depended on the hunt itself for fuel, not just for food. Think about that arrangement for a moment. One single successful hunt providing dinner, a warm fire to cook it over clothing to survive the following winter, and tools sharp enough to do it all again. Nothing wasted, nothing thrown away, an entire economy built around a single animal out of pure necessity, rather than any particular philosophy about waste. Have you ever noticed how the most resilient systems, whether we are talking about an ecosystem or a family or an entire community, rarely depend on just one single resource holding everything together? This landscape survived an ice age partly because it had built-in redundancy, dozens of interdependent species, each one filling a slightly different role, none of them essential entirely on their own, all of them quietly propping each other up. The people living among them seem to have absorbed that same lesson, whether they ever had the language to describe it that way or not, spreading their survival across many different animals, many different resources rather than gambling everything on just one. So when we talk about this stretch of frozen grassland acting as a refuge, I want to gently push back on how that word usually gets used. A refuge sounds like somewhere you retreat to, somewhere smaller, quieter, a little diminished compared to wherever you came from. This was not that. This was by any reasonable measure one of the richest, most productive corners of the entire Ice Age world, hiding in plain sight directly beside the largest wall of ice our planet had built in tens of thousands of years. It is a strange thing to sit with, honestly, the idea that the safest place on the entire map during the coldest chapter of an ice age was not some warm hidden valley, but a wind-battered plain most of us would take one look at today and immediately assume was empty. Appearances, it turns out, have never been particularly reliable narrators, whether we're talking about frozen grassland or people. While all of this abundance was quietly keeping bodies fed and fires burning, something else entirely was happening invisibly inside those very same bodies, A slow, patient process no one around that fire could have possibly seen, felt, or measured, but one that scientists today can trace with startling precision, buried not in frozen soil or ancient beetles this time, but in something even smaller, still carried quietly inside every single cell of every person living on that grassland. Nobody sitting around that fire could have felt it happening, and that is precisely what makes this next part of the story so remarkable to me. There were no symptoms, no visible signs, just an unbelievably slow, patient process unfolding inside the smallest possible corner of the human body, one that would not be discovered, understood, or even properly named for tens of thousands of years. Let me explain what I mean, because I promise this gets more fascinating the deeper you go. Tucked inside almost every cell in your body, separate from the main library of genetic information most people picture when they hear the word DNA, sits a tiny separate loop of genetic material called mitochondrial DNA. Think of your main genetic code as a thick shuffled deck of cards, half dealt from your mother, half from your father, reshuffled completely new with every single generation. Mitochondrial DNA does not play by those rules at all. It behaves less like a shuffled deck and more like a single carefully copied letter, passed directly from mother to daughter, then copied again by that daughter, and passed to her own daughter, without ever once being mixed with anything contributed by a father. Here is the detail that makes it so useful to historians and scientists alike. Unlike most of your genetic code, which gets shuffled together from both of your parents, mitochondrial DNA passes down almost untouched generation after generation, exclusively through mothers. Your mitochondrial DNA is essentially identical to your mother's, which is essentially identical to her mother's, stretching backward in an unbroken maternal line for as far back as human beings have existed at all. Small copying errors do creep in, occasionally random little mutations, but they accumulate at a famously steady, predictable pace, almost like a clock quietly ticking inside every one of us, measuring out time not in hours but in tens of thousands of years. Scientists call it, appropriately enough, the molecular clock. And in the late 1990s, a small group of geneticists realized this particular clock might finally be able to answer a question archaeologists had been arguing about for decades. By carefully comparing the mitochondrial DNA of Native American populations against their closest known relatives across Siberia, researchers could count the accumulated mutations separating the two groups, and use that count to estimate with genuine scientific rigor roughly how long ago the two populations had last shared a common ancestor. The first version of this idea appeared in 1997, proposed by a pair of Latin American geneticists who noticed the mutation counts simply did not add up under the older, simpler theory of a single quick migration. A decade later, in 2007, a much larger, far more detailed study led by researchers working out of the University of Tartu in Estonia sampled mitochondrial DNA from more than 600 Native American individuals across both continents, and the results were stunning enough to finally give this whole phenomenon its lasting name. The Beringian Standstill. Here is the number that changed everything. The genetic split between Native American and Siberian populations appeared to date back roughly 25,000 years, and yet the oldest confirmed archaeological evidence of people actually living south of the ice, anywhere in the Americas, only reach back around 15,000 years. Sit with that gap for a second, because it is the entire heart of tonight's story, written in the language of mutated genetic code rather than stone tools or frozen bone. 10,000 years unaccounted for. 10,000 years during which an entire population had already genetically split away from its Siberian relatives, yet had not yet appeared anywhere south of the ice sheets we spent time with earlier tonight. Where were they during those missing 10,000 years? You already know the answer because we have spent this entire evening walking through it together, hunting mammoth and horse across a grassland most people have still never heard of, decorating themselves with ivory beads, watching a wall of ice slowly seal the only way out, The DNA was not describing some other mysterious population. It was quietly confirming from inside the body itself the exact same story the ice, the sediment cores, and the frozen beetles had already been trying to tell us. Now here is where this story gets, in my opinion, almost unbearably beautiful, so bear with me for a moment. Researchers eventually traced nearly the entire genetic diversity of Native American populations, from the northern edge of Alaska to the southern tip of Patagonia, back to just a small handful of founding maternal lineages. 5 main ones carrying names that look more like a chemistry exam than a family tree A, 2B, 2C, 1D1 and X2A. Somewhere back on that frozen grassland, a small number of individual women, probably no more than a few dozen across the entire founding population, happened to be the ones whose maternal line survived intact generation after generation all the way down to today. Every other maternal line, every other woman living in that same camp simply did not have a direct unbroken chain of daughters surviving all the way to the present day, not necessarily through tragedy, often simply through the ordinary unremarkable randomness of history, a family having only sons for a generation or two, a line quietly ending not with drama but with statistics, which means quite literally that if you have any indigenous ancestry anywhere in the double continent stretching from the Arctic Circle to the southern coast of Chile, some part of your own genetic code traces back through an unbroken maternal thread, mother to daughter, hundreds and hundreds of times in a row, to a woman who once sat beside a fire exactly like the one we described earlier tonight. Can I ask you something? Does history usually feel that close to you, or does this particular thread feel different somehow once you realize it is not carved into stone somewhere in a museum, but quietly alive right now inside real people, going about their ordinary Tuesday? Most of the history we tell each other lives safely in the past tense castles. You can visit ruins, you can photograph artifacts sealed politely behind museum glass. This part of the story refuses to stay behind glass. It is sitting in living rooms right now in family gatherings in the quiet, unremarkable fact of someone's ordinary Tuesday afternoon, whether they have ever thought about it in these terms or not. I find myself truly moved by that more than almost anything else in this whole story, if I am being completely honest with you. Now, I promised you nuance tonight, not just a tidy, satisfying answer, so let me give you some. Because one particular thread in this genetic tapestry sparked a controversy that ran for years, and it involves that 5th lineage I just mentioned, the one called X2A. Unlike the other 4 founding lineages which have close, well-documented relatives scattered across Siberia and East Asia even today, X2A looked strange from the very beginning. Its closest relatives seem to sit not in Asia at all, but far to the west in parts of Europe and the Middle East. For a while, this single detail fueled an entire alternative theory, sometimes called the Solitarian Hypothesis, suggesting that a group of Ice Age hunters from what is now Spain and France might have paddled skin boats along the edge of the frozen North Atlantic and reached the Americas thousands of years before anyone crossed Beringia at all. The theory had a certain undeniable appeal, tying together 2 ancient stone tool traditions that looked at least on the surface strikingly similar and offering a dramatic alternative to the standard story most textbooks had settled on for decades. It is a truly fascinating idea, and I want to be fair to it for a moment because it was proposed by serious credentialed researchers, not fringe internet theorists. But the deeper geneticists dug, the less that particular thread held together. When researchers eventually sequenced the complete genome of an ancient individual known as the Ancient One, discovered along the Columbia River and dated to roughly 9,000 years old, they found him carrying one of the oldest, most deeply rooted versions of X2A ever recovered. For years, his remains had been at the center of a separate, painful legal battle between scientists wanting to study him and native communities who considered him a direct ancestor, deserving reburial rather than laboratory analysis, a tension worth remembering any time we talk about ancient genomes as though they were simply data points rather than someone's actual relative. If the Solutrean idea were correct that ancient lineage should have shown up first on the eastern coast of North America, the side facing Europe, instead it showed up on the west coast facing Asia, exactly where the Beringian story would predict it should. No European ancestry appeared anywhere in his genome at all. The wider scientific community weighing the full body of evidence ultimately set the Solutrean hypothesis aside, not because the question was uncomfortable to ask, but because the actual data, once it was finally available, pointed firmly back toward Siberia, back toward the very grassland we've been exploring together all evening. I think that story is worth including here, honestly, not to dunk on anyone who found the alternative idea compelling, but because it shows you exactly how this kind of science is supposed to work. Ask the bold question, follow wherever the evidence actually leads, and stay willing to set aside even an elegant, exciting idea the moment reality stops supporting it. I wish more of us were quite that disciplined about our own pet theories. If I am honest, whether we are talking about ancient migration routes or something as small as an argument with a family member, where we would rather be right than accurate. Good science at its best is really just a formal, disciplined version of admitting you might be wrong, applied patiently one careful measurement at a time. There is one more layer of nuance I want to leave you with before we move on, because good history rarely hands us a completely settled answer, and I would rather be honest with you than tidy. More recent studies using far larger samples of nuclear DNA rather than just the maternal mitochondrial line have suggested the population split may have happened slightly later than that original 25,000-year estimate, closer to 23,000 years in some analyses. Nuclear DNA carries its own advantage here, drawing on genetic information inherited from both parents, rather than just the maternal line alone, which gives researchers a much larger, richer pool of mutations to work with, even if the underlying math involved is considerably more complicated to untangle. The exact number is still being argued over in academic journals as we speak, refined a little further, with every new genome scientist managed to sequence. But the broad shape of the story, a population splitting away in genetic isolation, then waiting invisibly for thousands of years before finally appearing south of the ice, has held remarkably steady across every single method scientists have thrown at it. The fire, the ice, the beetles, and now the blood, 4 completely different kinds of evidence gathered by 4 completely different scientific disciplines, decades apart from one another, all quietly pointing toward the exact same conclusion. That kind of agreement does not happen by accident. When ice cores ancient beetles' mutation rates and complete genomes 4 lines of evidence that have almost nothing methodologically in common with one another, all independently arrive at the same basic shape of a story that is about as close to certainty as this particular kind of ancient history ever gets. So the genetic proof was there, sitting quietly inside every descendant of that founding population, long before anyone thought to go looking for it. But proof written in blood is not the same thing as proof you can hold in your hand. And for decades that second kind of proof, the physical touchable kind, archaeologists usually depend on, remained stubbornly, frustratingly absent, buried somewhere researchers could not yet reach. Which raises an obvious nagging question, one that quietly embarrassed an entire generation of archaeologists for the better part of 30 years. If thousands of people really did live on this landscape for 10,000 years, where exactly did they all go? Where are their campfires, their tools, their bones? Why did an entire homeland occupied for longer than recorded history has existed anywhere else on the planet leave behind what looked for the longest time like almost nothing at all? Here is a question that quietly embarrassed an entire generation of archaeologists, and I mean that with real affection, because eventually admitting confusion turned out to be exactly what cracked this mystery open. If a population large enough to seed 2 entire continents worth of descendants really did live on this landscape for 10,000 years, where did they actually go? Not genetically, we have already covered that. I mean physically. Where are the campfires? Where are the tools, the post holes, the discarded bones, the 1,000 small ordinary traces every single human community leaves behind without even trying? Every campsite we have talked about tonight, the fire pit in the opening scene, the beads and needles from the site above the Arctic Circle, all of it came from dry land. Solid, walkable, diggable dry land. If an entire population really spent 10,000 years living, hunting, raising children, and burying their dead across this landscape, logic says there should be hundreds of sites just like those scattered across the region, in vast, undeniable numbers. Instead, for most of the 20th century, archaeologists searching the interior of Alaska and the Chukotka Peninsula turned up disappointingly little to match the scale genetics was quietly insisting must exist. Scattered, isolated finds a handful of sites here and there, nowhere close to the density you would expect from a homeland occupied continuously for 10,000 years. The answer, once researchers finally accepted it, turned out to be almost absurdly simple and more than a little humbling. They had been looking in the wrong place, not because anyone was careless, but because the right place had spent the last 10,000 years sitting at the bottom of the ocean. Remember the grassland we spent so much time exploring earlier tonight, the richest, most productive stretch of this entire vanished world. That land tended to sit low, close to rivers, close to lake basins, close to exactly the kind of gentle resource, rich terrain any reasonable hunter-gatherer population would have preferred to call home rather than the higher, harsher hills nearby. Here is the cruel irony buried inside that preference. Low ground is precisely the ground-rising seawater reaches first. When the ice sheets we discussed earlier finally began melting in earnest, global sea level rose by more than 400 feet compared to where it sat at the depths of the Ice Age, and the very heartland of Beringia, the richest, most densely populated stretch of the entire region, quietly slipped beneath the waves of what we now call the Bering and Chukchi seas. The higher, drier ground on either side, the ground that eventually became modern Alaska and modern Chukotka, was real estate, but it was the suburbs. The city itself, if you want to think of it that way, is currently sitting under roughly 150 feet of frigid ocean water. Somewhere down there, entire river valleys still hold their shape beneath the mud. Ancient drainage channels researchers have already started mapping, using sound waves bounced off the seafloor, the ghost of a landscape nobody living has ever walked across. We know roughly where to look now, in other words. Knowing where to look and actually being able to look are unfortunately two very different problems entirely. So naturally you might be asking, why have we not simply gone down and looked? I promise you researchers have wanted to for decades. The first serious underwater survey of this stretch of ocean actually happened back in 1976, when a researcher named Dixon mapped out a predictive model for where ancient sites might be hiding beneath the Bering Sea floor. That was nearly 50 years ago now. Since then, by the most recent academic count available, only a small handful of dedicated scientific surveys have actually been carried out in this entire region across nearly 5 decades of opportunity. Compare that for a moment to the story we touched on earlier tonight about the drowned landscape sitting beneath the North Sea, which has had the benefit of a century of fishing trawlers, oil company surveys, and a dense, wealthy coastline packed with universities eager to fund the search. The Bering Sea has almost none of those advantages. No dense fishing fleet constantly dragging nets across the bottom. No thriving offshore oil industry quietly mapping the seafloor as a side effect of its own commercial interests. Just one of the coldest, most remote, most logistically punishing stretches of ocean on the entire planet, largely left to whichever small teams of dedicated researchers can scrape together enough funding to make the attempt. Even the oil companies that occasionally do survey these waters for entirely different commercial reasons are under no obligation to share what their equipment happens to record, which means potentially useful data may already exist, quietly sitting in a corporate database somewhere completely unavailable to the archaeologists who could actually use it? The honest answer involves one of the most difficult, most expensive environments on the entire planet to conduct any kind of careful scientific work in. If you have ever watched a certain reality television show about crab fishermen risking their lives in brutal, unpredictable waters, you already have a decent mental picture of the conditions researchers are dealing with. That show was filmed in this exact same stretch of ocean. Massive waves rising out of nowhere, boats fighting to stay upright, experienced crews still occasionally losing the fight against weather that seems to take genuine pleasure in being unreasonable. Now imagine trying to conduct careful, patient scientific fieldwork in those exact same conditions, rather than simply trying to survive them long enough to haul in a catch. Sudden storms punishing currents water cold enough to become truly dangerous within minutes of exposure, and a shipping season that only cooperates for a narrow handful of months each year, assuming the weather even agrees to behave itself. Divers technically can descend into these waters, but only to a maximum depth of around 130 feet, and even then only for a few practical minutes at a time before the cold and the physics of diving simply refuse to allow anything more. Across the sheer scale of ground we're talking about here, that limitation barely scratches the surface in almost every sense of that phrase. And here is a complication that makes the search even harder. Researchers estimate that somewhere between 10 and 50 feet of ordinary seafloor sediment has quietly settled on top of this landscape over the last 10,000 years, mud and silt drifting down year after year, slowly burying whatever lies beneath it, further out of reach with every passing century. You cannot simply swim down and glance around for an old campsite the way you might scan a hillside on dry land. Even the standard tools archaeologists rely on for a first quick investigation on land, small test pits dug by hand in a promising-looking spot, have no real underwater equivalent. The closest option researchers have is something called coring, forcing a narrow hollow tube straight down through the layers of mud to pull up a single thin sample, usually only about 4 inches across. Try to picture searching an area larger than many countries using nothing but a drinking straw poked into the ground one careful attempt at a time, with absolutely no guarantee any single attempt will land anywhere near something worth finding. Have you ever lost something small in a snowy backyard, a set of keys, a dropped earring, and spent 20 frustrating minutes scraping at the same 3 feet of snow, fairly certain it has to be right there somewhere? Now imagine that exact same feeling, except the backyard is roughly the size of a small country, buried not under a few inches of snow, but under 50 feet of freezing mud, and you only get to check one 4-inch wide patch of ground per attempt from the deck of a ship that cost you thousands of dollars just to reach. One researcher who studies exactly this kind of work put it about as plainly as I have ever heard it put. It is a genuine needle in a haystack problem, except the haystack happens to be roughly the size of a small country, submerged under freezing water, with a storm rolling in more often than not. And then there is simply the cost. Chartering a research vessel capable of safely operating out there runs somewhere between $8,000 and $15,000 a day, not including fuel, and those vessels tend to be booked out a full year in advance for a stretch of ocean where you cannot reliably predict the weather even 10 days ahead of time. Add up a realistic expedition, a proper research vessel, a trained crew, specialized coring equipment, and enough days at sea to actually accomplish something meaningful, and you are easily looking at a budget. Most university archaeology departments simply do not have sitting around waiting to be spent. Picture planning an enormously expensive expedition, reserving your one shot a year in advance, and simply hoping the sea decides to cooperate once you finally arrive. I do not know about you, but that particular combination of stakes sounds almost unbearably stressful to me, the kind of gamble most of us would never willingly sign up for. And yet researchers keep going back anyway, a little at a time whenever funding allows, because the potential payoff sitting down there is difficult to overstate. Cold water happens to be an extraordinary preservative, slowing down the microbes and bacteria that would normally break organic material apart within a matter of years on dry land. Clothing fragments, tool handles, even fragile plant material, all of it stands a real chance of having survived down there in something close to its original condition, effectively frozen in time by the very water that swallowed it in the first place. Researchers who have managed to pull sediment cores up from parts of this seafloor have already found preserved pollen grains and insect fragments, tiny fingerprints of an ancient landscape hinting at exactly how much more detailed information might still be waiting undisturbed just a little further down. One expert working in this field described the potential sites as almost pristine, a word you rarely get to use about anything 10,000 years old. So here is where I think this part of the story earns its place in tonight's journey. We spent the last section talking about proof written in blood invisible but mathematically undeniable. This section is the opposite problem, entirely proof that almost certainly exists sitting somewhere specific, physical, touchable, and yet still for now completely out of reach. Absence of evidence in this particular case was never actually evidence of absence. It was simply evidence of how difficult it is to search the bottom of one of the roughest oceans on the planet with the tools and budgets available so far. I think there is something worth sitting with in that distinction honestly in ordinary life as much as in archaeology. How often do we quietly assume something does not exist simply because we personally have not found it yet, rather than admitting we may just be looking in the wrong place with the wrong tools or without quite enough patience? Have you ever given up searching for something convinced it was lost for good, only to stumble across it years later in a spot you had somehow checked a dozen times before without ever really seeing it? I think entire fields of science go through that exact same experience, just stretched out across decades instead of a single afternoon. The ocean did not erase this story. It only postponed the ending, tucking an entire chapter safely away in the one place on Earth, almost guaranteed to keep it intact until someone finally arrives with the right equipment, the right funding, and frankly, the right amount of luck. I like to think of it less as a mystery that failed to solve itself, and more as a story patiently waiting for the rest of us to catch up with the technology it actually deserves. While that particular chapter continues waiting patiently beneath the waves, a handful of far smaller, far scrappier discoveries made on dry land in far less glamorous conditions were quietly starting to punch holes in almost everything mainstream archaeology thought it knew for certain. And the story of exactly how that fight played out is every bit as dramatic as anything we have covered so far tonight. For most of the 20th century, American archaeology had a rule so firmly established that questioning it out loud could quietly end a career. The rule went something like this. Nobody set foot south of the ice sheets in the Americas before roughly 13,000 years ago. Full stop, end of discussion. Researchers even had a name for the culture that supposedly started it all. Clovis, named after a small town in New Mexico, where distinctive, beautifully fluted stone spear points were first pulled out of the ground alongside mammoth bones back in the 1930s. These points were not crude either, carefully shaped, symmetrical, with a distinctive groove chipped into the base, allowing the point to be lashed securely onto a wooden shaft. Clovis points represented a genuine technological leap, sharp enough and strong enough to bring down an animal many times the size of the hunter holding it. For the better part of 60 years, Clovis was not simply considered an early culture. It was treated as the starting line itself, the first chapter page, one of the entire human story in 2 continents. Anyone claiming to have found something older was more often than not quietly dismissed before their evidence ever really got a fair hearing. Which brings us to a stubborn, weathered French-Canadian archaeologist named Jacques Cinq-Mars, and 3 small limestone caves tucked into a hillside in the northern Yukon, not far from a tiny village called Old Crow. Between 1977 and 1987, Cinq-Mars and his team spent their summers digging through these caves, known collectively as the Bluefish Caves, and what they pulled out of the ground should have made headlines around the world. Picture the scene for a moment, a small crew working short Arctic summers against the clock-hauling equipment into caves barely large enough to stand upright, in carefully sifting through layer after layer of frozen sediment in one of the most remote corners of the entire continent. Bones, thousands of them belonging to extinct horses and woolly mammoths, and scattered among that enormous pile a smaller collection bearing what looked to Cinq-Mars at least unmistakably like cut marks, the kind left behind by a stone tool slicing meat away from bone. Radiocarbon dating on some of these bones came back with a number that should have rewritten every textbook in the field almost overnight. Roughly 24,000 years old, 10,000 years older than Clovis, sitting directly inside the eastern edge of Beringia itself, exactly where the genetic evidence we discussed earlier tonight said an isolated population should have been quietly waiting out an ice age. You would think a discovery like that gets celebrated. Instead, it got buried not underground this time, but under a mountain of professional skepticism that would take Cinq-Mars the rest of his working life to fully climb out from under. I want to be fair here, because this is not simply a story about closed-minded scientists refusing to listen, distinguishing an authentic human cut mark from a scratch left by a scavenging wolf. A trampling caribou hoof or plain old geological grinding is truly difficult work, even with modern equipment. And back in the 1980s, the tools for making that distinction with real confidence barely existed yet. Cinq-Mars's colleagues were not necessarily wrong to ask hard questions. Science is supposed to demand strong evidence for extraordinary claims, and this was about as extraordinary as claims got. But somewhere between healthy scientific caution and outright institutional stubbornness, something went wrong. Funding for further work at Bluefish Caves slowly dried up. Cinq-Mars kept insisting his dates were solid, kept defending his interpretation at conference after conference, and watched year after year as the wider field simply moved on, without him treating his findings less like an open question and more like an embarrassing footnote nobody particularly wanted to revisit. Imagine spending an entire career convinced you have found something extraordinary, only to watch colleague after colleague quietly file your work under the heading of interesting but unconvincing, never quite dismissed, outright, never quite taken seriously, either stuck in a kind of professional limbo for the better part of 3 decades. A journalist who met him in the 1990s later described him as carrying himself with equal parts defiance and wariness, the posture of a man who had spent far too long being told politely but firmly that he was almost certainly mistaken. Have you ever been completely certain about something, watched everyone around you dismiss it anyway, and simply had to sit with that particular kind of loneliness for years, waiting for someone else to finally take a closer look? That is essentially where this story sat quietly for the better part of 3 decades. Then, in 2012, a doctoral candidate at the University of Montreal named Lauriane Bourgeon decided the old Bluefish Caves collection, sitting largely forgotten in storage at a museum, deserved a second look. She had access to something Cinq-Mars never did: decades of advancement in the science of identifying exactly what does and does not count as a genuine human cut mark, a rigorous set of 6 separate criteria involving the precise shape angle and trajectory of each individual incision. A mark left by a stone tool, it turns out, looks meaningfully different under magnification than a mark left by a gnawing carnivore, or the slow grinding pressure of sediment settling over thousands of years once you know precisely what details to measure. Bourgeon accepted nothing on a hunch. A mark had to satisfy every single one of her 6 criteria simultaneously, or it did not count at all, no matter how promising it looked at first glance. Bourgeon spent 2 full years working through more than 36,000 individual bone fragments, one at a time under careful microscopic examination, holding every single mark to that same strict, unforgiving standard. 2 years. Sit with that figure for a second. An entire doctoral candidate's early career spent hunched over a microscope examining bone fragments. Most of her peers would have considered a lost cause not worth the effort. Out of all 36,000 fragments, she confirmed exactly 15 bones bearing marks that met every single one of her 6 criteria. Genuine, unambiguous evidence of human butchery. She sent 6 of the strongest examples off for fresh radiocarbon testing. The oldest came back at 24,000 years, the very same number Cinq-Mars had been defending alone for nearly 30 years. One of those bones deserves special mention, honestly, because it is such a small human detail buried inside such an enormous scientific vindication. A horse jaw at its surface carrying a long, precise cut along the inner edge, exactly where you would slice if you were carefully removing the animal's tongue. A specific, practical, unmistakably deliberate piece of butchery carried out by someone very good at their job 24,000 years ago. Not a random scratch, not an accident of geology. Someone kneeling over a dead horse in the freezing cold doing careful practiced work with a stone blade leaving behind a signature. Only modern microscopy could finally read correctly. I keep coming back to that particular detail honestly more than almost any other fact in tonight's entire story. 24,000 years is such an enormous, almost meaningless number on its own, but a single deliberate cut mark made by someone who clearly knew exactly what they were doing, with a piece of meat that mattered to their survival, suddenly makes the whole abstract timeline feel like it belongs to an actual person again rather than just a line on a chart. The findings were published in 2017, and the response from the field this time around looked nothing like the silence Cinq-Mars had faced decades earlier. Researchers who had once quietly written him off now openly credited him with having been right all along. One archaeologist reviewing Bourgeon's work put it about as simply as possible, stating plainly that he was now convinced those marks were made by human hands. Jacques Cinq-Mars lived long enough to see it happen. Watching after nearly 30 years the same scientific community that had politely dismissed him finally come around to admitting he had been standing on solid ground the entire time. He passed away in late 2021 in his late 70s, having spent his final years not as a cautionary footnote, but as the archaeologist who had quietly been right about one of the most important sites in the entire hemisphere, decades before anyone else was willing to say so out loud. I do not know about you, but I find that particular ending quietly satisfying in a way most vindication stories never quite manage to be. Not bitter, not a triumphant victory lap either. Just a stubborn man, an ordinary horse jaw and enough patience on both sides of the story to eventually let the evidence speak for itself. And here is the detail that ties all of this directly back into tonight's larger story. Bluefish Caves does not sit in some unrelated corner of the map. It sits squarely inside the eastern reaches of Beringia itself, meaning this was not simply proof that people arrived in North America earlier than Clovis. It was physical, touchable, datable proof that people were already living inside the very refuge we spent this whole evening exploring, during the very depths of the Ice Age we described in painstaking detail, exactly matching what the mutation counts, hidden in modern DNA, had already been quietly insisting for years. Bluefish Caves was not an isolated instance of institutional stubbornness either, if that offers any comfort. A similar fight played out further south at a site called Monteverde in Chile, where archaeologist Tom Dillahay spent nearly 2 decades defending evidence of a settlement dated a full 1,000 years before Clovis, only finally gaining widespread acceptance in 1997, after a panel of skeptical experts flew in personally to examine the site with their own eyes. Dillahay had uncovered something remarkable there too. The preserved remains of a small camp complete with wooden hut foundations, hearths, and even fragments of medicinal plants, all protected for thousands of years beneath a waterlogged creek bed that had sealed the site away from the usual slow decay of time. For years, prominent voices in the field dismissed his findings the same way they had dismissed Cinq-Mars, until finally in 1997, 12 respected archaeologists made the trip themselves, examined the evidence directly, and reached a unanimous conclusion. Dillehay had been right all along. 2 continents apart, 2 stubborn researchers, 2 separate collections of bone and stone quietly waiting decades for the field to finally catch up with what the evidence had been trying to say the entire time. I think there is a real lesson buried in both of these stories, and it has nothing to do with archaeology specifically. The strength of an idea should never depend on how comfortable it makes the people currently in charge of judging it. Good evidence does not become less true simply because it arrives inconveniently ahead of schedule from someone the establishment was not quite ready to take seriously yet. Have you ever watched someone get dismissed for being right too early in your own life, at work, in a family argument, anywhere at all, only to be quietly proven correct years later, with little more than a shrug from everyone who doubted them the first time around? I think it happens more often than any of us would like to admit, and I think stories like Cinq-Mars deserve to be remembered partly as a gentle warning against being too quick to close a door, simply because what is standing on the other side of it seems inconvenient. Confidence, it turns out, is not the same thing as being correct, no matter how many decades a comfortable theory has already had to settle in. With Clovis First finally broken not by one lucky discovery, but by 2 stubborn scientists refusing to let quiet evidence stay quiet forever, an entirely different question came rushing in to take its place, one written not in stone tools this time, but in something infinitely more delicate, the small, fragile bones of children who never had the chance to grow old enough to tell their own story. In 2006, a small research team flew by helicopter into a stretch of dense boreal forest in central Alaska, following the winding path of the Tanana River toward a low rise of ground the local native community had always known by a much older name, Zasa Na, a place that had quietly waited undisturbed for longer than anyone could confidently guess. There is no road in. Even today, reaching this particular site means committing to a helicopter flight over unbroken spruce forest, landing on ground that offers no cell signal, no easy retreat, and no company beyond whoever flew in with you. Archaeologist Ben Potter of the University of Alaska Fairbanks would go on to spend years returning to this same patch of forest, carefully peeling back layer after layer of sand and silt, in search of an ancient hunting camp he suspected might be hiding underneath. In 2010, his team found something that stopped the entire dig in its tracks: the cremated remains of a 3-year-old child buried within a hearth pit at the very centre of the old camp. It was already one of the more emotionally difficult finds in the site's history. Nobody on that team could have guessed what was still waiting quietly beneath it. 3 years later, in 2013, digging further down directly under that same hearth, Potter's team uncovered something that would eventually rewrite an entire chapter of the story we've been telling tonight. 2 more infants buried together in a single carefully prepared pit. Both girls, both covered gently in red ochre, a deep rust-coloured mineral pigment that shows up again and again across ancient burials worldwide, almost universally associated with ritual ceremony and grief. Buried alongside them 4 carefully decorated antler rods, and a small collection of finely worked stone dart points, pieces that likely once belonged to a functioning weapon, deliberately placed there rather than simply lost or discarded. Weapons meant for hunting tucked gently beside 2 children who would never grow old enough to hold one themselves. Perhaps a father's own tools offered as the only gift he had left to give. One of the 2 infants had lived somewhere between 6 and 12 weeks before she died. The other heartbreakingly never lived outside the womb at all, a prenatal loss at around 30 weeks of development, making her, as far as researchers can tell, the youngest individual from this entire period ever recovered anywhere in the Americas. Genetic testing later confirmed the 2 girls were closely related, most likely first cousins, and that all 3 children found at this site, the cremated 3-year-old above and the 2 infants below, had died during the same season, sometime in the depths of an ancient summer. 3 children from the same small community gone within what appears to be a single hard season, a detail that hints quietly and without ever quite proving it outright at sickness or famine or some other hardship severe enough to claim several young lives at once. I want to pause here for a moment honestly, because I think it is worth sitting with exactly how much care is visible in this particular scene, even across 11,500 years. This was not a hurried, careless burial. Someone chose that red pigment deliberately. Someone selected specific meaningful objects to place beside these children tools that likely mattered to the family or to the community, rather than simply whatever happened to be lying around. Grief, it turns out, does not need written language to leave evidence of itself. It leaves ochre and carefully placed antler and a shared grave dug with obvious intention 11,500 years before anyone reading this sentence was ever born. The local native community working directly alongside the research team gave these 2 infants names in their own language, rather than allowing them to remain simply a catalogue number in some university database. A small but important gesture I think deserves real credit. This kind of collaboration has not always been the standard in archaeology, honestly, and it is worth saying so plainly. For much of the field's history, indigenous remains were studied, catalogued and stored without any meaningful input from the very communities directly descended from the people being examined, a pattern that caused real lasting harm and mistrust between researchers and the descendant communities they depended on. What happened at this site looked different, a partnership rather than an extraction, and I think that shift matters just as much as anything the DNA itself revealed. There is a real difference between studying someone and simply taking their name away from them, entirely treating a person who once lived and breathed as nothing more than a specimen number on a laboratory shelf. Giving these 2 children real names in the language their own descendants still speak today was a small act in the grand scheme of an entire scientific study, but it is the kind of small act that tends to say quite a lot about the people choosing to do it. The older infant became Zashitianen Tidagay, meaning sunrise child girl. The younger unborn infant became Yokanen Tidagay, meaning dawn twilight child girl. 2 names drawn directly from the earliest hours of morning, given to 2 children who themselves represent one of the very earliest chapters of an entire hemisphere's story. I do not think that naming was an accident, and I do not think it needed to be. Now here is where this quietly devastating discovery turns into one of the most important genetic findings of the last decade. In 2018, researchers successfully extracted and sequenced the complete genome from the older infant sunrise child girl, producing at the time the oldest full human genome ever recovered anywhere in the Americas. And the results did not simply confirm what scientists already expected to find. They revealed something nobody had been looking for at all. Her genetic code did not match the ancestry of any known Native American population living today. She belonged to something else entirely, a previously unknown distinct lineage researchers ended up calling the ancient Beringians. Using careful demographic modelling, the research team pieced together a rough timeline of exactly when different branches of this family tree split apart from one another. Think of it almost like tracing the branches of an old gnarled tree backward from a single leaf, using nothing but careful mathematics to figure out exactly which fork in the trunk that leaf originally grew from. Around 36,000 years ago, ancestors of this population began separating from other groups in East Asia. By roughly 25,000 years ago, that separation was essentially complete, a number that should sound familiar since it lines up almost precisely with the genetic divergence date we discussed earlier tonight from mitochondrial studies. Then, around 20,000 years ago, right in the depths of the very ice age we have spent this whole evening exploring, a second split occurred, separating the ancestors of sunrise child girl's own small community from the wider population that would eventually spread throughout the rest of the Americas. Only after that, sometime within the following 3,000 to 6,000 years, did the remaining population finally divide again into the broad northern and southern branches whose descendants live across both continents today. 4 separate branching points, each one confirmed independently by an infant's genome that had been sitting quietly in frozen ground for 11,500 years, waiting for the technology capable of reading it correctly to finally catch up. Do you see what that actually means? This is not simply another study confirming the standstill in the abstract. This is an actual family, an actual community caught directly inside that exact moment of separation, close enough to it that a child born into their small, isolated group still carried the genetic signature of people who had recently split away from everyone else, and would themselves eventually vanish as a distinct population, leaving only a faint genetic trace behind in later Native American groups. Sunrise Child Girl was not simply a Native American ancestor. She belonged to a branch of the family that essentially became an evolutionary dead end, a group that stayed behind in the far north, while their more distant cousins continued spreading south, eventually thriving into the hundreds of millions of descendants we talked about earlier. Her own line, the specific ancient Beringian branch she belonged to, appears to have simply faded out over the following millennia, absorbed or replaced, leaving behind only a small mathematical trace inside modern populations rather than a direct unbroken line of descendants. Can I ask you something? Does it change how you think about her knowing that this particular child represents not the beginning of a story that led directly to you, but a branch of the family that quietly did not make it all the way to today? I find myself thinking about her differently than I expected to, if I am honest. Less like a distant ancestor, and more like a relative from a branch of the family tree that simply ran out of time, the kind every family seems to have somewhere in its history, remembered fondly, but not directly responsible for anyone currently sitting at the table. Most family stories only bother remembering the branches that led somewhere, the relatives whose names eventually connect to someone still alive to ask about them. Sunrise Child Girl belongs to the branches we usually forget entirely, the ones that existed fully loved, fully grieved, fully, and simply did not happen to continue. I think that deserves remembering too, honestly, maybe even more than the branches that succeeded precisely because nobody else was ever going to do it for her. Sites like this one remain extraordinarily rare, by the way, which makes this particular discovery even more valuable. Researchers have identified only one other burial from this exact same window of time, anywhere across the entire Beringian world, a layer at Ushki Lake far across the water, on the Kamchatka Peninsula in Russia, roughly the same age, roughly the same significance, and just as thin on details. 2 known burials on 2 different continents, separated by an entire ocean, representing almost the complete physical record we currently have of an era that shaped the ancestry of hundreds of millions of people. 2 graves. That is the entire physical record on either side of an entire ocean, for a population whose genetic fingerprint touches nearly every indigenous person across 2 continents. I find that ratio almost dizzying once you actually stop to picture it, the sheer imbalance between how much this moment in history matters and how little of it survived in any form we can hold in our hands. That is how thin the evidence remains even now, even after everything genetics has managed to tell us. Every single fact we've just walked through together came from the DNA hidden inside 2 tiny infants, one of whom never even took a single breath outside her mother's body. I keep coming back to that thought, honestly. An entire lost branch of human history, an entire vanished population surviving into the present only because a grieving family 11,500 years ago chose to bury their children with red ochre and careful intention, rather than simply leaving them behind. Their grief, in a very real sense, is the reason we know any of this at all. Sunrise Child Girl and her small community represent the deepest point of the standstill, We had been tracing all evening the moment the wall of ice was at its most complete, the moment isolation was at its most total. She lived, as far as we can tell, at almost the exact hinge point of this entire story, born into a world still fully sealed off, and yet close enough to the eventual thaw that her more distant cousins, the ones whose branch did continue, were likely already beginning to feel the very first faint signs of change. But ice, as it turns out, does not stay in one place forever, and the very forces that had sealed this population away for thousands of years were already slowly beginning to shift, setting the stage for the ending none of these children would ever live to witness for themselves. Ice, it turns out, does not retreat the way most of us picture it happening. There was no single dramatic afternoon when the wall simply melted away and the sun came out. Starting somewhere around 19,000 years ago and stretching out over the following several thousand years, the two great ice sheets we spent so much time with earlier tonight began a slow, uneven withdrawal, shrinking a little more with each passing century, opening gaps in some places while stubbornly holding their ground in others. For the descendants of the people we've been following all evening, this presented something almost stranger than being trapped in the first place. A choice, or more accurately, two separate competing possibilities, and for decades archaeologists have argued fiercely over which one actually came first. The first option is the one most of us picture, instinctively a corridor of open dry land eventually opening up directly between the two shrinking ice sheets, a natural hallway running roughly along the eastern edge of the Rocky Mountains, connecting the far north to the open plains further south. For most of the 20th century, this ice-free corridor was treated as the obvious answer, the road Clovis hunters must have walked to, spread out across an entire continent. Picture a long, narrow strip of land squeezed between two shrinking walls of ice, gradually widening year after year, as both sheets pulled back from each other, eventually stretching more than 1,000 miles from the Arctic, down toward the open plains. On paper, it looks exactly like the kind of route a determined group of hunters would have jumped at the first opportunity to use. There was just one increasingly awkward problem. When researchers finally managed to properly date exactly when this corridor became passable, and more importantly biologically capable of actually feeding anyone travelling through it, the number that came back was uncomfortably late, somewhere around 13,000 years ago, and possibly even later than that before plants and animals had time to properly establish themselves along the route. An open path is not the same thing as a livable one. Even after the ice finally pulled apart enough to physically walk through the exposed ground left behind, would have been raw, freshly scraped rock and gravel, without the grasses, the game animals, or the fresh water sources a travelling family would have desperately needed along a journey stretching over 1,000 miles. Researchers studying ancient lake sediments from within the corridor itself found that useful plant and animal life did not really establish itself there until later, still meaning the earliest travellers, if they had tried this route first, would have been walking through what amounted to a very long, very cold famine. Meanwhile, archaeological sites far to the south, including the settlement we discussed earlier in Chile, were already showing credible evidence of people dated even older than that. You cannot walk through a hallway that has not finished forming yet, which means an entirely different route deserves serious attention, one involving considerably more water and considerably more nerve. Researchers call it the Kelp Highway, a name I happen to love honestly, because it manages to be both scientifically precise and a little bit poetic at the same time. The idea is fairly straightforward once you picture it correctly. Rather than walking south through the continent's interior, some of these early travellers may have moved along the Pacific coastline itself, hugging the shore in small boats, following an unbroken ribbon of thick, nutrient-rich kelp forest, stretching almost the entire distance from Northeast Asia down toward what is now California. Kelp forests, then as now, function almost like an underwater rainforest sheltering shellfish, fish seabirds and marine mammals in astonishing density, offering a coastal traveller nearly identical food resources at every single stop along an otherwise unfamiliar journey. Picture towering strands of kelp swaying just beneath the surface of the water, thick enough in places to calm the waves passing over them, sheltering an entire underwater neighbourhood of crabs, otters and fish, all within easy reach of a small boat paddling along the shoreline. You would not need to learn an entirely new way of surviving every few hundred miles. The kelp brought a familiar pantry with it all the way down the coast, and unlike the interior corridor, this coastal route may have been usable considerably earlier, with some researchers pointing to favourable conditions as far back as 16,000 years ago, or possibly even earlier still. For a long time this remained a compelling theory, with frustratingly little direct proof, mostly because rising sea levels since the Ice Age have quietly drowned much of the ancient coastline. These travellers would have used, tucking the evidence away underwater in a manner that should sound very familiar by this point in the evening. Then, in 2016 and 2017, a research team working on a small remote island off the coast of British Columbia found something that finally gave the kelp highway real physical teeth. On Triquet Island, archaeologists uncovered a hearth, a simple ring of charcoal and burned earth radiocarbon, dated to somewhere between 13,600 and 14,100 years old, making it one of the oldest confirmed settlements anywhere in North America. Here is the detail I find most moving about this particular discovery. The local Heiltsuk nation had always maintained an oral tradition claiming their ancestors survived the Ice Age specifically on this island, treating it as a place of refuge when the rest of the world was buried in ice. For generations that story existed only as oral history, the kind of claim outside researchers might politely nod along to, without ever quite taking seriously as literal fact. The hearth said otherwise. Modern radiocarbon dating run by scientists using instruments this community's ancestors could never have imagined simply confirmed what their own oral tradition had been saying all along. I think that deserves sitting with for a moment. Sometimes the oldest form of record-keeping human beings ever developed a story passed carefully from parent to child. Generation after generation turns out to be more reliable than we give it credit for, entirely capable of outlasting Empire's written language and every technological shortcut we've invented since. Not far from Triquet Island on nearby Calvert Island, researchers found something even more startling: a set of 29 human footprints, preserved in a layer of clay-rich soil that had been sealed beneath the sand for roughly 13,000 years. 2 adults and 1 small child walking together along an ancient shoreline, leaving behind the most literal, undeniable proof imaginable that people were here exactly where the kelp highway theory said they should be, exactly when it said they should have arrived. So which route actually came first, the interior corridor or the coastal highway? Honestly, the most likely answer at this point is both, just not at the same time. The coastal route almost certainly opened first, offering the earliest travellers a viable path south, while the interior remained hopelessly sealed, and only later, once the corridor between the ice sheets finally matured into truly passable resource-rich terrain, did a second wave begin moving through the continent's interior as well. Not a single dramatic breakout through one heroic doorway, but 2 separate doors opening at 2 different times, each one funneling a slightly different population south to eventually meet, mingle and spread across 2 entire continents. It is this interior route and the culture that eventually spread rapidly along it that gives us tonight's final remarkable character. Around 13,000 years ago, a distinctive new style of stone tool began appearing across huge stretches of North America, elegant fluted spear points, chipped with a precision that still impresses flint knappers attempting to replicate them today. Archaeologists name this culture Clovis, and for decades, as we discussed earlier tonight, it was mistakenly treated as the very beginning of the entire story, rather than simply one especially successful chapter within it. In 1968, on a ranch near the small town of Wilsall, Montana, construction workers operating heavy equipment accidentally uncovered something remarkable. More than 100 stone and bone tools, all of them dusted in the same deep red ochre we encountered earlier tonight, and buried among them the remains of a young child no more than 2 years old. Nobody involved that day set out looking for archaeology. They were simply clearing gravel for a construction project, when a front-end loader scraped straight into one of the most significant burial sites ever found in North America. An entire assemblage of finely worked Clovis tools that have been resting undisturbed for well over 12,000 years. Here is a detail from this particular story that I promise you could not make up if you tried. The little girl living on that ranch at the time watching the discovery unfold as a 2-year-old herself was named Sarah Anzik. She grew up, went on to study genetics professionally, and decades later found herself personally involved in sequencing the complete genome of the very same ancient infant discovered on her own family's land, when she herself had been the same age he was when he died. 2 children born roughly 12,600 years apart, connected by nothing but a small patch of Montana ranch land, and an improbable coincidence neither of them could have ever planned for. Can I ask you something? What are the actual odds of that, honestly, that the family who happened to own that particular stretch of ground would raise a daughter who happened to become exactly the kind of scientist capable of finally giving that ancient child back his own story, decades later, using tools that did not even exist the year she was born? I do not believe in fate particularly, but I will admit that some coincidences are patient enough and precise enough that they make you wonder for a moment anyway. In 2014, that genome was finally sequenced, and the results settled a debate that has been simmering in the background of this entire story. Anzik, as researchers now call him, showed direct, unmistakable genetic ancestry connecting him to the vast majority of Native American populations across both North and South America. A single small boy whose DNA quietly confirmed an unbroken thread, stretching all the way back to the frozen grassland we spent this whole evening exploring together, following the study and out of respect for Montana tribal communities who felt they should have been consulted earlier in the process. Anzik's remains were carefully reburied in June of that same year in an intertribal ceremony held in the Shields River Valley, closing a scientific chapter with the same quiet dignity his community insisted upon from the very beginning. 12,600 years after his own community wrapped him in red ochre, laid him to rest with objects meant to honor him, and said whatever words a grieving family says when language itself is still their only monument. He was returned to the earth once more, this time by people determined to get the ending right. Every thread we have followed together tonight. The frozen grassland, the wall of ice, the genetic mutations counted in a laboratory, the stubborn scientist who refused to stop believing his own eyes, the 2 infant girls buried beneath a hearth. All of it quietly converges into this one small boy and the improbable woman who grew up to read the story written inside his bones. I do not think it is an exaggeration to say this single burial on this single ranch in this unremarkable corner of Montana quietly settled a scientific argument that had been running for decades, simply by existing patiently exactly where he had been laid to rest all along. The wall had finally truly fallen, not all at once, not through one single heroic doorway, but slowly, unevenly through water and through stone, through kelp forests and mountain corridors, through footprints preserved in ancient clay and stone points chipped with startling precision, until an entire hemisphere finally lay open to the descendants of the people who had spent 10,000 patient years simply waiting for exactly this moment. But a story this long does not simply end the moment the ice retreats. And there is one final question worth asking before we let this particular fire burn down for the night. What any of this actually means for the millions of people walking around today who carry, whether they have ever thought about it or not, a small unbroken thread connecting them directly back to a single fire on a single frozen grassland that refused to go out. Let's go back just for a moment to where we started tonight. A woman waiting by a fire, listening to ice groan somewhere out past the edge of everything she could see. A little girl falling asleep with one hand still tangled in a fur blanket, completely unaware that she was living through one of the strangest, longest waiting periods in the entire story of our species. Think about everything that small family did not know sitting there in the dark. They did not know the word Beringia because nobody had been born yet who would ever need to invent it. They did not know their grassland home was slowly filling up with beetles and grasses that scientists tens of thousands of years later would study one frozen fragment at a time. They did not know 2 ice sheets somewhere beyond the horizon were quietly growing toward each other, preparing to seal an entire chapter of human history behind a wall taller than anything they could imagine. They did not know that a stubborn Canadian archaeologist would spend 30 years defending a horse jaw with a single cut mark on it, or that a 2-year-old girl playing on a Montana ranch would grow up to read an ancient boy's entire genetic story. She never knew any of what we have talked about tonight. She never knew her home would one day sit at the bottom of an ocean, never knew scientists would spend entire careers arguing about whether people like her even existed, never knew a small, stubborn piece of her own biology would end up travelling in an unbroken line across 2 continents and 11,000 years into the bodies of people she could not have possibly imagined. And yet here we are, today across the full length of 2 continents from the Arctic coastline of Alaska, down through the Andes and all the way to the wind-battered tip of Patagonia. There are more than 50 million people whose ancestry traces back at least in part to populations descended from exactly the kind of small resourceful community we spent this entire evening getting to know. In the United States alone, 574 separate tribal nations are formally recognized by the federal government today, each one with its own name, its own language, its own particular way of telling this same deep story. Canada is home to more than 600 distinct First Nations. Mexico, Peru, Bolivia, Guatemala, dozens of countries stretching down through Central and South America, each one carrying its own thread of a story that began, as far as we can currently tell, on a stretch of grassland most of their citizens have never even heard the name of. Add it all together and you're looking at a genetic and cultural legacy touching more people than the entire population of most countries on Earth, all descended at least in part from a population small enough that researchers can comfortably estimate its size in the hundreds, not the millions, from a few hundred to tens of millions in roughly 11,000 years. I do not think there is a single empire in recorded history that grew that dramatically, and this particular expansion was never planned, never conquered, never announced by anyone standing on a balcony. It simply happened quietly the way a seed happens to become a forest given enough patient centuries and the right conditions to finally take root. Different languages, different foods, different songs, different ways of marking a wedding, a birth, a death. A grandmother in the Andes weaving a pattern passed down through hundreds of generations might never think to compare her own family history to a fisherman's stories on the coast of Alaska or a farmer's traditions in the highlands of Guatemala. Why would she? On the surface, these lives share almost nothing in common. Different climates, different governments, different centuries of history layered on top of everything that came before. And underneath almost all of that beautiful, staggering diversity, one shared quiet inheritance, a genetic memory of 10,000 years spent waiting out an ice age together, in a place the rest of the world would eventually forget existed at all. I keep returning to a single idea tonight, turning it over again and again, and I want to leave it with you before we close. We tend to imagine history as something built by kings, by armies, by grand decisions made in palaces and parliaments. We are taught to picture history as a series of loud events battles, one empire's founded declaration signed with a flourish in front of a crowd. Tonight's story suggests something quieter and honestly a little more comforting. Sometimes the most important thing a group of people can ever do is simply refuse to disappear, not conquer, not build a monument. Just keep the fire lit, keep the children fed, keep choosing morning after morning for 10,000 consecutive years to try again without ever once knowing whether the door on the far side of the ice would ever actually open. No parade ever celebrated that kind of persistence. No statue was ever built for the specific act of simply not giving up during winter, number 6211. And yet that unglamorous, unremarkable persistence is the entire reason any of the rest of this story was even possible to tell tonight. They did not know they were founders of anything. They did not know their patience would eventually become the ancestry of Olympic athletes, poets, farmers, physicists. And yes, probably at least a few people watching this video right now, half asleep, wrapped in a blanket of their own, on the opposite side of the planet from where this whole story began. I find that thought almost dizzying if I sit with it too long. The idea that an achievement this enormous was never actually planned by anyone, never voted on, never announced. It simply accumulated one ordinary unremarkable day at a time, the same way most truly important things in life usually do. I think we forget that constantly in our own lives just as much as in ancient history. We wait for some clear, decisive turning point to arrive before we let ourselves feel proud of how far we have come, when usually, if we are honest, the actual turning points were never that clean or that visible while we were living through them. They were just Tuesday, then another Tuesday, then eventually 10,000 more Tuesdays quietly adding up into something that finally looked from a distance like an entire hemisphere of history. Have you ever been in the middle of a long uncertain stretch of your own life? A wait with no clear end date, no guarantee it would resolve the way you hoped. Waiting on a diagnosis, waiting on a decision that was never fully in your hands to begin with. Waiting for a relationship, a career, a simple sense of steadiness to finally arrive on some schedule nobody ever agreed to share with you in advance. If so, I hope there is something quietly steadying in knowing that an entire population once lived through exactly that feeling, stretched across thousands of years instead of months, and simply kept going anyway, one ordinary day at a time without any of the science, the DNA studies or the archaeology. We now have to reassure them it would eventually be worth it. They had no ancient documentary to watch reassuring them that people 10,000 years before them had also waited this long and had also made it through. They simply had each other and the next morning and the next decision about whether to keep the fire going. They just kept the fire burning because that was the only thing to do that actually made sense. And it was. It was worth it even if none of them ever got to see the proof of that for themselves. I think that might be the quiet, honest lesson underneath everything we have covered tonight, and maybe underneath most of history if you look closely enough. Very little of what actually matters gets decided in a single dramatic moment. Almost all of it gets decided in the ordinary, unglamorous, repeated choice to keep going made over and over by people who will usually never live to see how the story finally turns out. Maybe that is worth remembering the next time your own life feels like it is stuck in a waiting room with no clear exit sign. Somebody somewhere in your own family tree, whether they lived in a frozen grassland 11,000 years ago, or simply survived a difficult decade a little closer to our own time, already proved that persistence like that eventually pays off, even when it does not feel like it will, even when there is no way to see the ending from where you happen to be standing tonight. There is still so much we do not know, by the way, and I think that is worth saying honestly before we close for the night. Somewhere beneath the cold water of the Bering Sea, an entire landscape is still waiting patiently for the right technology, the right funding, and the right amount of luck to finally bring it back into the light. We talked earlier about how difficult that search really is, the cost, the weather, the sheer scale of ocean involved. None of that difficulty has gone away. If anything, it makes the eventual discovery, whenever it finally happens, feel even more worth waiting for. Somewhere in a frozen riverbank in Siberia, or a quiet hillside in the Yukon, or a research lab that has not been built yet, there's very likely another small ordinary discovery waiting to rewrite some detail of tonight's story all over again, the same way a horse jaw and 2 tiny milk teeth and 1 small boy from a Montana ranch already have. Maybe it will be another child's grave carefully covered in ochre. Maybe it will be a single strand of ancient hair caught in a fold of frozen sediment, holding a genome nobody has thought to look for yet. Maybe it will simply be a more patient scientist decades from now, taking a second look at a box of bones some earlier researcher quietly filed away, as unremarkable the same way Bourgeon once did for a stubborn man named Cinq-Mars. This is not a finished story. It never really was. It is simply the part of it we happen to know so far, and I find something strangely peaceful in that rather than frustrating. The world still has secrets worth keeping you curious. So before you drift off tonight, I just want to say thank you sincerely for spending this time with me, for letting a small frozen grassland at the edge of the world hold your attention for as long as it did. That is not nothing, honestly. There are 1,000 other things you could have spent the last few hours doing, and instead you chose to sit with a fire that went out 11,000 years ago, and somehow it still managed to warm the room a little. Stories like this one only really work because someone on the other side is actually listening, and tonight that was you. If any part of this journey moved you, taught you something new, or simply gave your mind somewhere gentle to rest for a while, I would love to know whenever you feel like leaving a comment down below, no rush at all. Tell me which part stayed with you the longest, the little girl by the fire, the 2 infant sisters buried in red ochre, the stubborn scientist who waited 30 years to be believed, or the improbable woman who grew up to read the story hidden inside a boy's bones on her own family's land. I read every single one, even the ones that arrive long after a video first goes up, so please do not feel like you have missed some invisible window. There is no expiration date on curiosity. Wherever you are right now, whatever kind of day led you here tonight, I hope what follows is a deep, easy, well-earned rest. Let the fire in this story do a little of the work for you. Let the ice and the grassland and the 10,000 quiet years of waiting settle into the background of your mind the way a familiar song does, until your own thoughts finally start to soften and slow down along with it. And whenever you're ready to come back, there is always another story waiting quietly by the fire for you, another forgotten corner of history ready to be pulled gently back into the light, the same patient way this one just was. Sleep well. I will be right here whenever you're ready to continue.